The deputy grabbed the disabled nurse by the arm and shoved her against the medication cabinet while a police K9 off its leash crossed the treatment room in 4 strides and hit her at full speed. And instead of biting, the dog pressed its massive head against her carbon fiber leg brace and refused every command to move. The room went completely still. Deputy Holt Greer reached for his radio. K9 Commander Devlin Marsh went white, because that dog had last been seen in a classified military evacuation file stamped Kandahar province, and the woman it recognized wasn't supposed to exist in a place like this. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to my channel and follow along to the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning started the way most mornings did at Creston Valley Veterinary Trauma Center. Loud, understaffed, and smelling of antiseptic and wet dog. Mara Solis had been at the clinic since 5:45. She wasn't scheduled until 7, but the overnight tech had called out sick, and Mara knew what that meant. She'd been covering gaps like that for 3 years. She didn't complain about it. She just pulled her jacket on over her scrubs, drove the 18 minutes from her apartment in Dunmore, Colorado, and started checking supply levels before the day shift arrived. The carbon fiber brace on her left leg made a faint clicking sound when she moved between the storage room and the treatment ward. She'd stopped hearing it a long time ago. Other people hadn't. Clients sometimes looked down when she walked past. New hires asked once what happened, and she gave them the shortest version she had. Nerve damage, military service, a long time ago. And most of them learned quickly that she didn't want to go further than that. Creston Valley wasn't a large facility. It had 2 trauma bays, a surgery suite, 4 recovery kennels, and a triage area that functioned as everything from an intake room to a waiting space when things got busy. It sat on the edge of a commercial district, surrounded by a feed supply warehouse and a self-storage facility, which made it easy to miss if you didn't already know it was there. But the people who needed it knew. The working dog handlers from the County K9 unit came through regularly. Ranchers brought in injured livestock dogs. Mara had treated everything from a cattle dog with a punctured lung to a search and rescue shepherd who'd come down off a mountain with frostbite on 3 paws. She was good at her job. She was precise, she was fast, and she kept her head when things went sideways. The other nurses knew it. Dr. Nadia Osei, the clinic's lead veterinarian, trusted her with procedures she didn't usually let technicians handle. That trust had been earned over years of showing up early and staying late and keeping quiet about both. The medication room was where everything started that morning. Mara had been running a standard supply check, controlled substances logged, doses accounted for, refrigerated medications verified. It was a task she completed 3 times a week because the clinic's inventory software had been misfiring for over a month. The system was supposed to auto-populate dispensing records when a staff member logged in administration. Instead, it was creating duplicate entries, logging medications twice, sometimes 3 times, making it look as though supplies were being used at twice the actual rate. She had flagged the issue in writing 4 times. She'd submitted a request for a software review to the clinic administrator. She'd documented every discrepancy manually in the physical log and attached notes explaining the probable cause. None of it had been acted on yet. The administrator was dealing with a lease dispute and a billing audit and had told her it was on the list. Mara accepted that. She kept doing the manual corrections and waited. What she didn't expect was Deputy Holt Greer. He arrived at 7:20, before most of the day staff had clocked in. He was tall, dressed in a county sheriff's uniform, and he carried himself with the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. He had a clipboard and a badge, and he asked the front desk coordinator, a young woman named Priya who had been working there for only 5 months, to produce the clinic's controlled substance dispensing records for the past 60 days. Mara was still in the medication room when she heard Priya's voice go high and uncertain. She stepped out to the hallway. "Can I help you?" Mara said. Greer looked at her brace first, then at her face. "You the charge nurse?" "I'm the lead trauma nurse. Dr. Osei isn't in until 8. What's this about?" He told her. A complaint had been filed with the County Health Compliance Office. Anonymous, he said, alleging that a staff member at Creston Valley had been falsifying controlled substance records. Greer was there to conduct a preliminary review of dispensing logs as part of an initial inquiry. Mara kept her voice level. "Those records are accessible, but the logs have a known software issue. I've documented it. I can show you the written reports. I'll look at whatever the logs show, Greer said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. What the logs show right now isn't accurate. He looked at her again, not with curiosity, with the particular expression of a man who had already made up his mind and was now just collecting what he needed to confirm it. Why don't you let me determine that? She took him to the medication room. She pulled up the digital system and showed him the dispensing report for the past month. The duplicated entries were immediately visible, the same medications logged twice on the same dates, in some cases bearing staff ID numbers from nurses who hadn't been on shift. She walked him through 3 specific examples, showed him the corresponding physical log entries, and then pulled up her written reports to the administrator, each one time-stamped. Greer looked at the screen for a long moment. These reports, did anyone from administration confirm receipt? Not in writing, but they're on the server with timestamps. The first one is from 6 weeks ago. So you have no confirmation that anyone reviewed your concerns? Mara looked at him. No, but the reports exist. And these entries here? He pointed at the screen to a line where her staff ID appeared next to a logged administration of ketamine. That's your ID number? Yes, that's a real administration. The duplicate below it is the software error. So you're saying half of these entries under your ID are false? I'm saying the software generated them automatically. It's not the same thing. He wrote something on his clipboard. Mara watched his hand and felt something tighten in her chest. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but the particular sensation of watching someone build something with the wrong materials and refuse to acknowledge they have the wrong blueprint. I'm going to need you to move away from the medication room while I complete this review, Greer said. She kept her voice quiet. That's a working clinical area. We have patients coming in at 8. I understand that, but until I've completed the initial assessment, I need the area secured. You can't restrict access to a trauma clinic's medication supply during operating hours. Patients, I'm not asking you, Greer said. I'm telling you. She stepped back. Not because she agreed with him, because she was experienced enough to know that escalating with a deputy who had already locked onto something wasn't going to move the situation in any useful direction. She stepped back, kept her hands visible, and let him do what he was going to do. But she didn't leave the hallway. Priya appeared beside her, holding a clipboard of morning intake forms and looking like she wasn't sure whether to run. Is this bad? She whispered. It's inconvenient, Mara said. Go set up triage. At 8:15, Greer emerged from the medication room with 3 pages of printed logs and a look that said he thought he had exactly what he needed. He found Mara at the triage desk. I need a written statement from you, he said, acknowledging that your staff ID appears on dispensing entries that you cannot account for. Mara looked at the form he placed on the desk. She read it once. It asked her to confirm, in her own handwriting, that she had observed irregularities in her own dispensing behavior. She read it again to make sure she'd understood it correctly. No, she said. Greer's jaw tightened. This is a standard procedural statement. This says that I observed irregularities in my own dispensing behavior. I didn't. The software generated false entries. Those are not the same thing, and I'm not signing something that conflates them. You are making this significantly more complicated than it needs to be. You are asking me to sign a document that implies I behaved improperly. I didn't. She pushed the form back across the desk, not aggressively, just steadily. I'll give you a written statement describing what the software does and how I've documented it. I'll give you the full written record of every report I filed. That's what I'm able to offer. Greer picked up the form. He looked at her with that same settled certainty. People who are innocent, he said, don't usually resist this hard. Mara looked at him for a moment. It was a quiet look. Not angry, not theatrical, just the kind of look a person gives when they have heard something so far from accurate that they don't quite know where to start. You don't know what you're looking at, she said. He suspended her access badge at 8:47. He did it at the front desk, in front of Priya and the 2 day shift technicians who had just arrived, and a client named Mr. Hatcher who was waiting with a border collie in a wire crate. He held the badge scanner in one hand and told Mara, in a voice loud enough for all of them to hear, that she was to consider herself restricted from the medication room, the supply area, and the surgery suite pending investigation. Mara stood still. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She watched him speak, registered the way Mr. Hatcher stared at her brace and then at her face, registered the way the young technician named Darla looked at the floor, registered all of it, and kept her expression exactly where it was. "You can wait in the staff lounge," Greer told her. "I'll wait at the triage desk," Mara said, "which is not on the restricted list you just described." Greer looked like he wanted to add it. He didn't. She walked to the triage desk, lowered herself into the chair without ceremony, and began filling out a formal written rebuttal on a blank incident report form. She wrote the date, her name, her staff ID, and a precise description of every interaction that had occurred since 7:20. She wrote without editorializing. She listed facts, timestamps, and the specific language Greer had used. She had done enough documentation in her previous life to know that how you wrote something mattered as much as what you wrote. At 9:15, Dr. Osei arrived. She walked in to find her lead trauma nurse sitting at the triage desk with a handwritten incident report and a county deputy doing something on a laptop in the medication room doorway. Osei was a composed woman. She had done a veterinary residency in Cape Town and worked 2 years in an underfunded wildlife rescue facility before coming to Creston Valley, and very little visibly rattled her. But the particular set of her expression when she looked at Mara's face told Mara that Osei understood immediately that something had gone wrong. Osei spoke with Greer for approximately 4 minutes. Mara didn't hear the full conversation but caught fragments: software issue, multiple reports, jurisdiction, clinical continuity. When Osei came to the triage desk, she had her phone in one hand. "Are you all right?" Osei said quietly. "I'm fine, I've written it all down." Mara passed her the incident report. Osei read it. She didn't look up from the paper until she'd finished. "This is accurate?" "Verbatim where I can remember it." "He suspended your badge?" "Yes." Osei inhaled slowly. "I'm calling the clinic administrator and our legal contact. Don't sign anything else." "I already didn't." "Good." Osei started to walk away, then turned back. "He had no right to do this in front of clients." "I know," Mara said, "but he did it anyway." That was the thing about Holt Greer. He didn't do things secretly. He didn't seem to think he needed to. At 9:50, he came back to the triage desk and stood in front of Mara with his clipboard pressed flat against his chest. "I want to be clear with you," he said. "I'm not here to cause problems. I'm here because a complaint was filed and I have an obligation to investigate it." "I understand that," Mara said. "Then why aren't you cooperating?" She looked up from the desk. "I've answered every question you've asked. I've shown you the documentation. I've offered you the full written record of the software reports. What I haven't done is sign a statement that misrepresents what happened. I don't consider those the same thing." He studied her. She noticed he kept glancing at the brace, not in a lingering way, not obviously, but repeatedly, the way people do when something doesn't match their expectation and they can't quite figure out why. "It's a lot of effort," he said finally, "for someone who says they've got nothing to hide." Mara held his gaze. "My leg doesn't have anything to do with this." His expression shifted slightly. She had named the thing he hadn't said out loud, and he didn't like that she had. "I didn't say anything about your leg." "You looked at it 4 times in the last 2 minutes," Mara said. "I noticed things." He left the triage area without another word. At 10:20, everything changed. The first alert came across the radio, clipped to Greer's belt. She heard it before he did. A multiple vehicle collision on Highway 9 southbound, approximately 6 miles from the clinic. Initial reports described at least 3 vehicles, 2 of them county patrol units. Officer injuries. Possible K9 casualty. Civilian casualties. All nearby medical facilities receiving overflow. A second alert followed 40 seconds later. County dispatch was requesting veterinary trauma support for working dogs. Creston Valley was the nearest facility with trauma capability. Greer stood in the hallway with his radio in his hand. The change in the room was immediate. Priya straightened behind the desk, the 2 technicians looked at each other, and Mara was already moving. She had a trauma kit out of the storage cabinet and onto the triage counter before Greer registered what was happening. "You're restricted?" he started. "From the medication room and surgery suite," Mara said, pulling on gloves. "Not from trauma intake. Get out of the doorway." He didn't move immediately. She moved around him. Osei appeared from the back, already pulling her hair into a tie. She took in the scene at one glance. Mara at the triage counter. Prepping supplies. Greer standing in the middle of the floor with his radio, both technicians waiting for direction. "Clear the trauma bay," Osei said. "Darla, get IV line set up." Mara, "Already on it," Mara said. Greer stepped toward Osei. That nurse is under investigation. I don't think she should. She is my trauma nurse, and this is a mass casualty intake. Osei's voice didn't rise. It just became very precise. If you have a clinical objection, you can file it later. Right now, you're in my way. The first vehicle arrived at 10:38. It was a handler's truck, moving fast. The man who climbed out was broad-shouldered and moving in the particular stiff way of someone who was injured and refusing to acknowledge it. He had a Belgian Malinois on a shortened leash, and the dog was favoring its right foreleg badly. Behind him, a county EMS unit pulled around to the parking lot with two more handlers. Mara met them at the door. She assessed the dog before the handler finished his first sentence. Laceration on the shoulder, right foreleg showing abnormal weight distribution, respiratory rate elevated. She put her hand on the dog's back and felt him flinch and then settle. That particular exhale that injured animals sometimes did when someone who knew what they were doing touched them. "What's his name?" she said. "Bricks," the handler said. "We went through the windshield. You should be at the hospital." "I'll go when he's stable." She didn't argue. She'd seen that exact conversation before, in different places, with different types of people who all had the same particular relationship with the animal they worked beside. She got Bricks onto the table and started the assessment. The trauma bay filled fast. Two more dogs came in within 20 minutes. Dr. Osei was in surgery almost immediately with the worst case, a shepherd whose internal injuries from a secondary collision were severe. Darla was managing two recovery patients and an incoming critical. Mara ran triage on everything that came through the door. It was during the third intake that she heard the new vehicles in the lot. She heard them before she saw them. Heavy tires on gravel, multiple vehicles, the kind of organized arrival that came from a unit rather than individual responders. Through the triage window, she caught a flash of dark tactical green and a County K9 unit insignia. The man who came through the door first was not wearing a standard uniform. He wore a tactical vest over a dark green shirt, shoulder insignia she didn't look at long enough to read, and a controlled expression that she recognized from a context she hadn't revisited in a very long time. Behind him, on a thick leash held in a way that made it clear this wasn't a patrol assignment, was a Belgian Malinois she recognized the instant the animal cleared the doorway. The dog was bigger than she remembered. His muzzle had gone gray at the edges, but his eyes were the same. She was wearing gloves, holding a trauma assessment sheet, standing 8 feet away at the triage counter, and the dog locked onto her before the door had fully swung shut. The man holding the leash said something. A command, clear and sharp. The dog took one step in her direction and stopped, still stiff, quivering the way a working dog does when it is fighting its training for something it wants more than the command it has been given. The man said the command again. Harder this time. The dog's head went down. His body language shifted. Not submission, not confusion, but something she had seen in exactly one context before. In a different country, in a different life. When a working dog decided that the situation in front of it required overriding everything it had been taught. He broke into a run. The man, the commander, she registered now, reading the vest insignia, said Rook, halt in a voice that could have stopped a vehicle. Rook did not halt. He crossed the treatment room in 4 long strides and hit Mara at the shoulder, not hard enough to knock her over, but solidly, the way a large dog greets someone it has been looking for. Then he pressed his head against the carbon fiber brace on her left leg and went completely still. The room had stopped. Greer, who had been standing near the hallway entrance watching the trauma intake with the expression of a man trying to find something actionable in what he was seeing, had his hand on his radio. Both of the handlers near the recovery area were staring. Priya, behind the desk, had put down her clipboard. The commander stood in the middle of the triage room and looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not recognition exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something, the precise moment when a fact you have encountered somewhere before starts to resurface. Mara looked at the dog pressing against her leg. She looked at the gray around his muzzle, at the old scar running along the left side of his neck, just below the ear, that she had sutured herself in a field medical tent with inadequate light and her hands still shaking from the blast concussion. She lowered her free hand and put it on his head. "Hey, Rook," she said quietly. The commander's face went the color of old concrete. His hand tightened on the empty leash. He said, in a voice that came out lower and slower than he probably intended, "What did you just call him?" She looked up. "That's his name." Who told you his name? She held the commander's gaze. Nobody told me. He stared at her. Rook hadn't moved. His body was pressed against the brace. His breathing had slowed, and he had the complete settled stillness of an animal that had found something it had been searching for without knowing it was searching. Greer took a step toward the group. Commander, I don't know what's happening here, but this nurse is currently under investigation, and she's already attempting to— Be quiet, the commander said. He said it without looking at Greer, without inflection, the way you say something to a static noise you have decided you can deal with later. He was still looking at Mara. My name is Devlin Marsh, he said. I'm commanding officer of the Creston County K9 Tactical Unit. He paused. His jaw was working slightly, the way a person's does when they are running through something internally at high speed. Where did you serve? Mara looked at him for a moment. The triage room was completely quiet except for the sound of equipment in the back and Rook's slow breathing against her leg. That's a long answer, she said. Give me the short version. She held his gaze. 68th Joint Medical Evacuation, Kandahar Province, 2014 to 2017. Marsh's expression did not change outwardly, but something behind his eyes shifted. The particular look of a person who has just matched a name to a face they have seen only in a document, in a classified report, in a file stamped with a designation that meant the contents were not for general distribution. Greer's radio crackled. He answered it, turning away. More incoming from the highway accident. But Marsh didn't move. I was looking at Mara's leg, at the brace specifically, at the point where Rook's head was pressed against it, with the expression of someone doing arithmetic they hadn't expected to need. I have a file, Marsh said slowly. A tactical medical report from 2016. Convoy ambush. A joint evac unit. 3 casualties stabilized under fire. He paused. The medic who wrote it never signed her name. Regulations said she had to, but the report came through unsigned. We always figured the submission was clerical. Mara said nothing. There's a notation at the end, Marsh continued. Handwritten. Says the K9 unit's dog had shrapnel injuries to the left neck and the medic sutured them in the field before he was evacuated. He paused again. His voice was careful, like someone moving across ice they haven't tested. Rook came to us 2 months after that. Transfer from a classified military medical unit. His neck scar. We were told it was a field suture. We were never told who did it. Greer had turned back. He was listening now, his earlier certainty visibly complicating. Mara looked at Rook. He still hadn't moved. She looked back up at Marsh. What do you need right now, she said. In this room, right now. Marsh blinked. He looked around the triage area as if remembering suddenly where he was. 3 dogs injured in the highway collision, 2 handlers who might need medical assessment, an ongoing investigation that was now producing a result nobody had anticipated. I have 2 dogs incoming, Marsh said. Moderate injuries, both mobile. Then let's do that first, Mara said. She straightened. Rook moved with her, staying close to her left side. You can ask me whatever you need after. Greer stepped forward. Hold on. She's restricted. From 2 rooms in this clinic, Marsh said. He turned and looked at Greer with the particular expression of a man who has assessed a situation and found one element in it to be irrelevant, not from practicing her job. He looked at Mara. Unless the deputy has documentation placing you on clinical suspension. Mara looked at Greer. Greer looked at his clipboard. He had suspended her badge access. He had not suspended her clinically. He didn't have the authority for that. It was the kind of mistake a person made when they were moving faster than the regulation they were relying on. The badge covers room access, Marsh said, not clinical function. I know the county regs. He turned back to Mara. Do your job. She was already moving. The next 2 hours were the kind that compressed time. Not because they were smooth, but because they were the opposite. Because everything required fast decisions, and each decision had consequences, and there was no margin for hesitation. Mara ran triage on 4 dogs and assisted Dr. Osei with a complex repair on the shepherd from the first wave. She managed 2 handlers' minor lacerations using the clinic's first aid supplies because neither of them would leave until their dogs were stable. She kept Greer out of her operational space by staying precisely within whatever he hadn't explicitly restricted. Rook stayed close throughout. He was professionally trained enough to remain out of the work area when she needed him to. But every time she stepped away from a procedure and moved through the room, he was at her left side, his gray muzzle level with the carbon fiber brace. Marsh watched her work. He didn't interfere. He didn't ask additional questions. He stood at the far side of the triage room with his arms crossed and his expression carefully arranged into something neutral. And he watched her the way a person watches something they are still in the process of confirming. At 12:40, the acute wave had passed. The trauma bay had 3 recovering patients, all stable. The surgery was complete. The handlers were drinking terrible coffee in the staff lounge. Marsh came to the triage counter. Mara was finishing her intake notes, writing with her left hand because her right had a slight tremor she managed by switching when it got bad. A remnant of the blast concussion, the same one that had destroyed most of the nerve function in her lower left leg. "I need to ask you something," Marsh said. "Then ask." He put a photograph on the counter. She recognized it. Not the specific print, but the type. Tactical documentation, the kind taken for unit records during a deployment, slightly overexposed from field conditions. "That's Rook," he said. 2 weeks after the transfer. His neck scar is still fresh in that photo. He paused. "I pulled this file this morning after we got the call about the highway collision. I bring it everywhere. I've been trying to identify the field medic for 4 years." Mara looked at the photograph. Then she looked up at Marsh. "Mara Solis," she said. "Staff Sergeant, 68th Medical. Medically discharged February 2017. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He looked at the brace. He looked at her face. He put 2 and 2 together with the delayed expression of a person who had been carrying a question for a long time and was now realizing the answer had just appeared in a trauma clinic in Dunmore, Colorado, under the most improbable possible circumstances. "You saved his life," Marsh said, "and 2 soldiers, and you still got everyone out." 3 soldiers, Mara corrected. "The 3rd one walked out on his own, but he'd have bled out without the femoral pressure. He just never made it into the official report." Marsh nodded slowly. "Why didn't you sign the report?" he said. She looked at her notes, at the stack of intake forms for the morning, at the incident report she had written about Greer, still sitting in its folder on the edge of the desk. "I don't need credit," she said. "I just need to do the work." Marsh picked up the photograph. He turned around and looked at Greer, who was standing near the hallway entrance with his clipboard and his suspended badge, and the particular expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting to find one thing and had found something else entirely. "Deputy," Marsh said. His voice was quiet, but it had something underneath it, a quality that came from authority that had been genuinely earned rather than assigned. Greer looked up. "I want to see the documentation behind your investigation," Marsh said. "Everything, the complaint, the logs, the statement you tried to get her to sign, all of it." Greer's expression shifted. "That's an internal county compliance matter. She's a veteran of a classified military medical unit, and I have reason to believe the investigation targeting her may be based on incomplete information." Marsh paused. "I'm not asking as a courtesy. I'm asking officially. Do you understand the difference?" The room was very quiet. Greer looked at his clipboard. Then he looked at Mara. She was watching him with the same expression she had held all morning. Not triumphant, not angry, just steady, the look of someone who had been waiting for the arithmetic to work out. He reached into his folder and pulled out the complaint form. His hand wasn't entirely steady. Marsh took it. He read the first 3 lines. Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes that meant he had seen something in those lines that confirmed something he had suspected. He looked at Mara. She looked back. The complaint form. The investigation. The suspended badge. The statement she hadn't signed. The software log she had flagged 6 weeks before any of this started. It was all there. And it was beginning to look considerably different than it had at 7:20 that morning. Greer's radio crackled again. He answered it. His voice, for the first time all day, had lost some of its certainty. And Mara Solis looked at the gray-muzzled dog sitting beside her left leg and felt, for the first time in a long time, something she had stopped expecting. The particular sensation of being seen clearly by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. Marsh set the complaint form on the triage counter between them. "Whoever filed this," he said, "had access to your staff logs." He turned the form over. At the bottom, in the space marked complainant, the line was blank. Anonymous. Standard procedure for initial filings. But at the edge of the form, faint but legible, was a notation Mara hadn't seen before. A case file cross-reference number that shouldn't have existed if this was truly a new complaint. It was the number of a previous investigation, one that had been filed, reviewed, and closed 8 months ago, before she had ever been involved. Mara looked at the number. Then she looked at Greer. He had gone the color of old concrete. The case file cross-reference number sat on the triage counter between them, like an accusation nobody had made out loud yet. Mara had read enough incident documentation in her previous life to know what a cross-reference number meant in this context. It meant the complaint filed against her hadn't originated in a vacuum. It meant someone had reached back into a closed file, a prior investigation, reviewed and dismissed, and used it as a scaffold for something new. That wasn't how anonymous tips worked. That was how targeted campaigns worked. Marsh picked the form back up. He looked at the number again, then at Greer. This case reference. Pull it up. Greer's jaw moved. That's a closed compliance file. I'd need authorization from... You're the investigating deputy. You have access to your own case file system. Marsh's tone hadn't changed. It still had that quality underneath it, patient in the way that a pressure valve is patient. Pull it up. Greer reached for his phone. His movements had a new quality to them, something slightly less certain, like a man walking on ground that had recently been confirmed solid, but was no longer entirely sure of it. He typed. He waited. He looked at the screen. Then he looked up. It's a prior complaint against the clinic, he said. Filed 8 months ago. Different complainant. Alleged general medication mismanagement, not specific to any staff member. He paused. It was reviewed and closed. No findings. Who closed it? Marsh said. Greer hesitated. Deputy Willard Foss, retired 4 months ago. Mara watched Marsh absorb that. He didn't react visibly, but she'd learned enough in a few hours to read the slight adjustment in how he held himself. The way a person settles their weight differently when a variable they hadn't anticipated enters the equation. Who had access to that closed file, Marsh said, that would have known the case reference number to include on a new complaint? The room didn't have a good answer for that. The people in it did, but nobody was saying it yet. Greer turned to his clipboard. He wrote something, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. He was working through something that his earlier certainty hadn't prepared him for, and it showed in small, unguarded ways. The way he cleared his throat, the way he straightened his collar twice in under a minute. Mara pulled the incident report she'd written that morning out of its folder. She placed it on the counter next to the complaint form. She didn't say anything. She just let Marsh look at both documents sitting beside each other and draw the arithmetic himself. He drew it. She could see him doing it. I want the clinic's security footage, Marsh said. Specifically the footage covering the medication room and the triage area for the past 6 weeks. Can that be accessed? The system saves 30 days, Mara said. But Dr. Ose may have copies from longer. We had an incident in April, a break-in attempt in the parking lot, and she had the administrator back up the whole system. Get her. Mara went to get her. Dr. Ose had just come out of surgery. She was still in her gown, pulling off her gloves, and her expression when Mara explained what had happened in the last 40 minutes was the particular expression of someone who had suspected something was wrong and was now being told how wrong specifically. Security footage, Ose repeated. Marsh wants 6 weeks. I'll call the system company directly. Give me 20 minutes. She got it in 15. The footage came up on the clinic's administrative laptop, pulled remotely by the security company at Ose's authorization. Marsh sat at the administrator's desk. Ose had offered it without ceremony. And Greer stood to his left, and Mara stood near the doorway because there wasn't enough room for everyone, and also because she wanted the ability to leave quickly if the footage showed something she hadn't anticipated. She was fairly sure it wouldn't, but she had learned a long time ago not to be entirely sure of things you hadn't verified. The footage showed what she expected. It showed 6 weeks of Mara flagging software errors. It showed her writing reports at the triage desk at odd hours, before shift, after shift. It showed her walking Priya through the duplicate entry problem in the 3rd week, explaining it at the triage counter with the laptop open between them. It showed her, in week 5, physically stopping a technician named Torres from logging a medication because the system had already auto-populated a false entry and she wanted him to do it manually to avoid another duplicate. It showed all of that. What it also showed, and this was the part that made Greer go very still, was footage from 4 weeks ago. The medication room, late in the evening, after close. A figure in a non-staff jacket, moving quickly, at the medication room door. The badge scanner reading a code. The door opening. Not Mara's badge. A different code. The figure spent approximately 6 minutes in the medication room. The angle wasn't perfect. The camera caught the door and the edge of the counter, but not the interior. But what it captured was enough. The timestamp, the badge code, the duration. Marsh looked at the badge code for a long moment. Can you trace this ID? Ose leaned over and looked. That's not a current staff badge. Our badges use a different format. She looked at the number more carefully. That format matches our old system. We migrated last year. The old codes were supposed to be deactivated. Supposed to be, Marsh said. I assumed they were. Someone kept one active, Marsh said. He looked at Greer. Or reactivated one. Greer had stopped writing. He was staring at the screen with the expression of a man who had come in this morning expecting to close a simple case and was now standing inside a considerably larger problem than he had budgeted for. I need to make some calls, Greer said. You'll make them here, Marsh said. Not a suggestion. Greer looked at him. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, the reflex of a man who was used to being the one who set the terms. But Marsh had a quality that Greer's earlier certainty didn't have, which was that his authority wasn't dependent on the room agreeing with him. He held the space differently. Greer made his calls there. Mara stepped out of the administrator's office. She walked to the triage desk, sat down, and looked at Rook, who had followed her from the office doorway and was now sitting at her left side with his chin lifted, watching her face. You always did know what a room needed, she said to him quietly. He blinked. His tail moved once. She put her hand on his head and stayed like that for a minute. Not long. She didn't have the luxury of long. Priya appeared at the desk with 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Mara without speaking, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for her all day. Is it bad? Priya said. She was better at reading situations than her months on the job suggested she should be. It depends on who you ask, Mara said. I'm asking you. Mara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It's getting complicated, which usually means it's getting closer to something true. Priya nodded like that made sense and went back to the front desk. The next development came from outside the clinic. At 1:40, a county patrol unit pulled into the parking lot. The deputy who climbed out was not one Mara recognized. He went directly into the administrator's office, bypassing the front desk. He was in there for 11 minutes. When he came out, his expression was controlled in the effortful way of someone carrying information they haven't decided what to do with yet. Mara watched him cross the triage area and exit the clinic without speaking to anyone. She looked at Marsh, who had appeared in the administrator's doorway behind him. Marsh's expression had changed. It was still controlled, but underneath the control was something more activated. The look of a person who has received new information and is now integrating it at speed. He crossed to the triage counter. That deputy pulled the badge log from your system, Marsh said. The old code access from 4 weeks ago. They traced the badge number. Mara waited. It was issued originally to a staff member who left the clinic 14 months ago, Marsh said. A technician. But the badge was supposedly returned and deactivated at termination. Supposedly, Mara said. The log shows it was reactivated from the administrative portal 3 days before the access event on the footage. The reactivation was authorized under an administrator-level credential. He paused. Not Dr. Ose's credential. Mara's hand was very still around the coffee cup. Whose? Marsh looked at her steadily. The clinic administrator's. A Mr. Damon Farr. She said nothing for a moment. Damon Farr had been the administrator for 2 years. He was the person she had submitted the software error reports to. The person who had told her the issue was on the list. The person who had not confirmed receipt of any of her documentation. He's been dealing with a lease dispute, Mara said carefully. And a billing audit, Marsh said. Yes, we know. A beat. The billing audit was triggered by a prior county health compliance review, the same one that generated that closed case file, the one from 8 months ago. She worked through the sequence. The prior complaint, closed without findings, far under audit pressure. The software issue she'd flagged that he'd never addressed. The old badge reactivated through his credentials. The midnight visit to the medication room. The new complaint filed against her. using the old case reference number that only someone with access to the closed file would have known. It came together like a map that had been lying flat on a table all along, waiting for someone to look at it from the right angle. He needed someone to pin it on, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what the audit division is going to determine, Marsh said. Officially, but yes, that's what it looks like. She looked at the triage counter, at the incident report she'd written that morning, which was now one piece of a larger document set that she hadn't known she was assembling. I filed 4 reports, she said. He got every one of them and did nothing because he needed the discrepancies to look like staff error. He also needed a specific staff member to be the visible problem, Marsh said. Someone who could be presented as a liability. Someone whose pushback against the accusation could be framed as defensiveness. He paused. Someone who might not fight back. Mara heard what he didn't say. Someone who might be dismissed quickly. Someone who could be moved out of the room before they asked the right questions. Someone a deputy investigating a complaint might look at and see a brace and a hesitation and make an assumption. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where's Far now?" "He called out sick this morning," Marsh said, "before Greer arrived." She sat with that. The timing of it. Far calling out sick on the specific morning, a county deputy arrived to conduct an investigation he had initiated. She didn't have enough to call it confirmed, but she had enough to call it a pattern, and patterns were the currency of every investigation she had ever participated in. Greer appeared in the administrator's doorway. He looked at Mara and then at Marsh, and his expression had undergone a significant renovation since 7:20. The settled certainty was gone. What was there now was something more complicated. A man trying to locate his original map in terrain that had turned out to be different from the one he'd been handed. "The badge log," he said. He stopped. He tried again. "The reactivation from the admin portal." "I know," Marsh said. "If Far authorized it, I know." Greer looked at Mara. He didn't speak right away. She let the silence run because she had nothing useful to fill it with, and she was too tired for diplomacy. She didn't mean. "The statement I asked you to sign," Greer said finally. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not regret exactly. Not in the way she'd have preferred, but something adjacent. The discomfort of a person recognizing that they had been a tool in something they hadn't understood. "I was operating on what the complaint described." "I know that," she said. "I shouldn't have restricted your badge in front of clients." "No," she said. "You shouldn't have." He didn't say anything else. She didn't help him. Some silences were worth preserving. At 2:30, Dr. Osei called the clinic staff together in the staff lounge. There were 5 of them. Mara, Darla, 2-day shift technicians named Ramos and Pellier, and Priya, who hovered in the doorway still holding her intake clipboard like a shield. Osei didn't give a speech. She explained factually what had been discovered, what the county investigation was now looking at, and what it meant for the clinic operationally. She said the county audit division had been formally notified. She said Far's access credentials had been suspended pending review. She said she was personally reinstating Mara's badge access effective immediately and that she had documented her authorization for that in writing before coming into this room. "Any questions?" Osei said. Ramos raised his hand. "Are we going to be closed?" "No, we are not going to be closed." "What about the controlled substance logs, the audit?" "The software company is sending a technical team tomorrow. The audit will be conducted on the corrected data, not the duplicate entries." She looked at Mara. "Because someone documented the problem every time it occurred." Mara looked at the table. "I do have one question," Darla said. She looked at Mara with a careful expression. "Did you know? This morning, when it all started, did you know what was happening?" "I knew something was off," Mara said. "I didn't know the shape of it yet." "But you kept working, even after he suspended the badge." "The dog still needed intake," Mara said. It was the simplest true thing she could say. Darla nodded slowly. She looked at her hands. "I looked at the floor," she said. "When he did it at the front desk, I looked at the floor and I didn't say anything." Mara looked at her. Darla was 23 and had been at the clinic 8 months and had probably never been in a room where something like that happened before. "That's okay," Mara said. "It was a complicated situation." "It wasn't that complicated," Darla said. "I just wasn't brave enough." Nobody had a useful answer for that, so they let it sit. The meeting ended at 2:50. Marsh was waiting in the triage room when Mara came out. He had Rook's leash in one hand and his phone in the other, and he looked like a man who had been on the phone consistently for the past 20 minutes and had just hung up on something significant. "The county sheriff's office is opening a formal misconduct review on Greer," he said. "The way he conducted the investigation, the badge suspension in front of clients, the statement form, the way he ignored documented evidence before proceeding. They're looking at the full record." Mara absorbed that. "That's between him and the department." "It is," Marsh said. "But it's relevant to you because the review will include an official assessment of whether his actions constituted procedural misconduct. If it does," he paused, "your incident report this morning becomes a formal evidence document." She had written it in 4 pages with timestamps. She had written it that way on purpose, without entirely knowing why, because the habit of precise documentation was deeper in her than most things. "And FAR?" she said. "Audit Division is coordinating with the county DA. The badge reactivation, the access event, the prior complaint. They're building a timeline." He looked at his phone. "It's going to take a few weeks, maybe more." "Cases like that usually do." "You've seen cases like that before." It wasn't quite a question. She looked at him steadily. "I've seen people create paper trails that they thought pointed at someone else," she said. "And I've seen what happens when the paper gets turned over." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he held out Rook's leash. "Walk with me. Outside. 5 minutes." She took the leash. They walked out through the clinic's back exit into the small parking lot that abutted the storage facility. The afternoon had gone heavy and warm, the kind of Colorado afternoon where the mountains in the distance looked close enough to touch, and the air smelled like coming rain. Rook moved between them, occasionally touching his gray muzzle to Mara's left leg, as though checking that the brace was still there. Marsh didn't speak for the first minute. He walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the middle distance, and she let him work up to whatever he was working up to because she had learned that forcing that kind of moment produced worse results than waiting. "The Kandahar file," he said finally. "The convoy report. There were 3 citations generated after the fact. Once we were able to reconstruct the incident from the surviving unit's accounts." He paused. 2 were assigned to identified personnel. The 3rd was listed as unconfirmed medic, 68th Medical. He stopped walking. Rook stopped with him. "It was recommended for a commendation, the kind that doesn't come with a ceremony. You'd have received notice through official channels." "I didn't receive anything," Mara said, "because you were medically separated by the time it was finalized, and your forwarding address in the discharge paperwork was wrong," she said. It wasn't surprising. The discharge process had been fast and logistically chaotic, and she'd been in enough pain to not catch every detail. "I knew there might be paperwork I missed." "It wasn't just paperwork," Marsh said. He looked at her directly. "It was a commendation citation for actions under fire resulting in the preservation of 3 military personnel and 1 working K9 asset under conditions defined as extreme threat." He paused. "You never received it." She looked at Rook. "I was sitting between them in the parking lot, watching her face with the patient attention of a working dog that had been trained to read human affect and had, over many years, gotten very good at it." "I didn't do it for the paperwork," she said. "I know that. That's not the point." He reached into his vest pocket and held out a folded document. "That's a copy of the citation. The original is on file with the Military Records Division. I pulled it this morning after Rook reacted to you." He held it out another moment. "I've been carrying a copy for 2 years, in case I ever found the person." She took the document. She didn't open it. She folded it once more and put it in her scrub pocket. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The person who filed the original complaint on the clinic, 8 months ago, the one that got closed, was it FAR?" Marsh was quiet for a second. "The original complaint was filed from outside the clinic, but the investigation notes, the ones that FOSS closed without findings, include a notation that a staff informant provided supporting detail." He paused. "The notation doesn't name the informant." She processed that. "An outside complaint with inside support, 8 months ago, before the software started misfiring." "The software problem," she said slowly. "How long has it actually been active?" Marsh looked at her. "The technical team will have to confirm, but based on the log timestamps your team documented, the first duplicate entries I noticed were 10 weeks ago," she said. "But the entries go back further. I found older duplicates when I was building the correction log. I just assumed they were pre-existing errors I hadn't caught." She paused. "What if the software problem was manufactured? What if someone introduced it deliberately?" The parking lot was quiet. Behind them, inside the clinic, she could hear the faint sound of a dog moving in a recovery kennel. Marsh looked at the mountains in the distance. "That changes the timeline significantly," he said. "It changes what Farr knew and when he knew it," she said. "It changes whether the discrepancies in the logs were an accident he tried to exploit or a situation he created deliberately. That's a more serious charge." "Yes," she said. "It is." Marsh turned back toward the clinic entrance. He pulled out his phone. "I need to make another call. Get back inside. Osei's going to need you for the evening wave." She started toward the door, Rook beside her. "Solis," Marsh said. She turned. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the way he looked when he was saying the thing he'd been building toward. A man who chose his moments and took care with them. "The people who wrote that Kandahar report," he said. "The ones who reconstructed the incident. They said the medic they were looking for had a particular quality. They described it as—" He paused, finding the word. "Relentless. Not in a reckless way. Just that she didn't stop until every person in that evac site was accounted for, even when it wasn't safe. Even when her own injuries—" "That wasn't relentless," Mara said. "That was just the job." He nodded slowly. "That's what they said you'd say." She turned back to the clinic door. She was 3 steps from the entrance when Priya appeared in the doorway, moving with the particular controlled urgency of someone who has just received information they don't know how to hold. "Mara." Priya's voice was low and tight. "Farr is here." Mara stopped. "He came in through the back. He's in the administrator's office right now, and he's on his computer, and—" Priya swallowed. "He's deleting files." Mara was already moving before Priya finished the sentence. She covered the distance to the back hallway in 12 steps, Rook at her left side without being asked, and she heard Marsh's footsteps behind her. He'd caught the word deleting, and that was enough. The administrator's office was at the far end of the staff corridor, past the supply closet and the technician break room, and the door was partially open. Through the gap, she could see the blue-white glow of a monitor, and she could hear the rapid, uneven clicking of a keyboard that had the rhythm of someone working in a hurry rather than someone who knew what they were doing. She pushed the door open. Damon Farr was seated at the administrator's desk with his jacket still on and his car keys sitting on the corner of the desk, like he'd planned to be in and out in under 5 minutes. He was mid-40s, lean in the way of a man who ran obsessively and still looked tense, and his expression when he saw Mara in the doorway was a specific kind of startled, not the startle of someone surprised, but the startle of someone caught, which was a different muscle group entirely. He recovered fast. She gave him that. "Mara." He said her name like he was in charge of the conversation. "I heard there was an incident this morning. I came in to review." "Step away from the computer," Marsh said from behind her. Farr looked past her to Marsh, and the expression recalibrated again. He'd seen the tactical vest. He'd clocked the rank insignia. He sat back in the chair but didn't stand up, which was its own kind of calculation. "Commander, I don't know what you've been told, but I'm the administrative director of this facility. I have every right to access these files. Your credentials were suspended 90 minutes ago by Dr. Osei pending county review," Marsh said. "You were notified by email at 1:17. He stepped into the office, moving Mara gently to one side with a hand gesture she obeyed because she recognized the tactic. He was putting himself between Farr and the exit. "That notification would have been delivered to your county health admin email address. The same address on the facility operating license." Farr's jaw tightened. "I didn't see any email." "You came in through the back entrance," Marsh said, "bypassing the front desk. On a day you called out sick." He paused. "At what point were you planning to explain your presence here?" The monitor was still active. Mara could see it from where she stood. The screen showed the clinic's document management system, the same server-based platform where she had filed her software error reports. A deletion dialog was open. It was waiting for confirmation. She could see the folder label. Medication management, staff reports, Q1, Q3. Her reports were in that folder, all 4 of them. She looked at Farr. He was watching her face. He saw her see it. Something changed in his expression then. Not guilt exactly, because she didn't think Damon Farr processed what he'd done as guilt. It was something more like the specific kind of anger that belongs to people who have been moving a scheme forward carefully for a long time and are now watching it stop. A problem solver's frustration. The irritation of a plan interrupted. "Don't," Mara said. He reached for the mouse. Marsh crossed the office in 3 steps and put his hand flat on the desk between Farr and the keyboard. He didn't grab Farr. He didn't need to. He just placed his hand there and looked at Farr with an expression that settled the question without requiring a sentence. Farr sat back. Marsh turned to the doorway. Greer had appeared there. He'd followed from outside and was now standing with his hand on his belt radio, reading the room with the careful expression of a man recalibrating everything he'd thought he knew about this morning. "I need this workstation secured," Marsh said. "Nothing else deleted, nothing transferred, session logged as of now." Greer stepped in without argument. Whatever he had been this morning, he was making different choices now. He pulled his radio and called it in. Farr looked at Mara. She looked back at him. "Those reports," she said, nodding at the monitor. "You got every one of them." He said nothing. "You told me it was on the list. Weeks ago you said that. The software issue, the review request, all of it. You told me it was on the list." Still nothing. "You needed the discrepancies," she said. "You needed them to keep building so that when the audit team looked at the logs, there was enough noise that someone had to be responsible for it. And you needed that person to not be you." Farr's expression didn't break. He was too controlled for that. But something around his eyes did something that wasn't denial, and that was enough. Dr. Osei had appeared in the doorway behind Greer. She looked at the monitor, at the deletion dialogue still waiting for confirmation. And then she looked at Farr with an expression Mara had never seen on her before. It was quiet and cold and contained, the expression of a person who has just confirmed something they hoped wasn't true. "Get out of my chair," Osei said. Farr stood up. Slowly, with the preserved dignity of a man who had not finished calculating his options. The county audit investigator arrived at 4:10. Her name was Bellamy Voss. She was with the County Health Compliance Office, and she moved through the clinic with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done many of these and didn't waste time on introductions she didn't need. She went directly to the administrator's office, reviewed the secured workstation with the forensic technician she'd brought with her, and began building the document record. Mara gave her statement to Voss in the staff lounge at 4:40. Marsh sat in. Greer was not present. He had been asked, politely but specifically, to wait outside. The statement took 25 minutes. Mara gave it the way she gave every formal account, factually, in sequence, without embellishment, distinguishing clearly between what she had observed directly and what she had inferred. Voss asked follow-up questions that were sharp and specific and indicated she had already reviewed a significant portion of the documentary record before arriving. At one point, Voss looked up from her notepad and said, "You filed 4 written reports about the software issue, all time-stamped, all on the server. Why didn't you escalate beyond Farr?" "He was the appropriate escalation point," Mara said. "The clinic's reporting structure goes staff to charge nurse to lead nurse to administrator to the operating physician. Dr. Osei had the software issue flagged on her weekly briefing document, but the actual review request had to come through admin." "You didn't go directly to Dr. Osei?" "I flagged it verbally to Dr. Osei in week 3. She said she'd follow up with Farr directly." Mara paused. "He told her the same thing he told me, that it was on the list." Voss wrote something. "Did it occur to you that the lack of response was intentional?" "It occurred to me that it was negligent. The intentional part I didn't confirm until today." Voss studied her for a moment with the look of someone taking a longer measurement than the notepad suggested. "You kept documenting anyway." "Yes." "Even without confirmation that anyone was reading it?" "Especially without that," Mara said. "Unread documentation is still documentation. The timestamps don't care whether someone opened the file." Voss capped her pen. "That documentation," she said, "is the reason this case has a foundation." Mara didn't respond to that. She had learned over many years that the most useful thing you could do with a compliment from an investigator was let it sit without touching it. At 5:15, the forensic technician produced the first preliminary finding from the workstation review. Mara wasn't in the room when it came through. She was back in the trauma bay, managing the early evening intake, because the clinic had not stopped requiring clinical work simply because everything else was happening. A rancher had come in with a border collie that had gotten into a barbed wire fence. A handler from the highway accident had returned because his dog had developed a secondary complication. She sutured and assessed and monitored and kept moving, and Rook stayed in the triage area where Marsh had settled him with a water bowl and a mat, watching the door. It was Marsh who came to find her. The technician found something in the deletion queue, he said. He stood at the edge of the trauma bay, not entering, respecting the clinical space. Files that Farr had queued for deletion tonight, automated, scheduled, not what he was doing manually when you came in. She tied off the suture she was working on, stepped back, checked the border collie's vitals one more time. What files? Email correspondence between Farr and an external address. He paused. 15 months of it, starting 4 months before the original complaint was filed. She pulled off her gloves. Who's the external address? We don't know yet. The domain is a private hosting service. Voss has a subpoena running. He looked at her steadily. But the subject lines are visible in the metadata. Some of them. She waited. One of them says, Solis, Disability Accommodation Review. He paused. From 13 months ago, before any of this started. She stood with that for a moment. 13 months ago, she hadn't been under any investigation. The software wasn't misfiring yet, or not visibly. She had been a lead trauma nurse who had recently completed a successful advocacy campaign for improved recovery protocols for working dogs. She had done it quietly, through the proper channels, without making noise. She'd thought nobody had noticed. Someone had noticed. They were looking at me before any of this, she said. It came out flat, not shocked. She had seen enough operational planning to recognize the shape of advanced targeting. It looks that way, Marsh said. Voss will pursue it, but yes. She looked at the border collie, now settled and drowsy in the recovery position. Looked at the handler standing in the corner, watching her with the particular gratitude of a person whose working partner had just been pulled back from a bad outcome. She thought about Farr sitting in the administrator's office this morning. Except he wasn't in the office this morning. He called out sick. He called out sick on the exact morning Greer arrived. Because he knew Greer was arriving. Because Farr had filed the complaint. Because the complaint was the mechanism he needed to move her out of the clinic before the audit got close enough to look at the logs clearly. He had picked her specifically. She'd been picked not because she was careless or dishonest, but because she was disabled and quiet and meticulous. And someone had calculated that meticulous and quiet and disabled was the combination least likely to fight back effectively. They had been wrong about the fighting back part, but they had also come significantly closer to succeeding than she was entirely comfortable with. I need 10 more minutes with this patient, she said. Then I'll come back in. Marsh nodded. He left. She turned back to the recovery kennel and did the next 10 minutes of her job exactly as she would have done them without any of the rest of it, because the border collie didn't know about any of the rest of it and didn't need to, and deserved her full attention anyway. At 6:30, Bellamy Voss called a brief in the staff lounge. Present, Voss, Marsh, Greer, Osei, and Mara. The forensic technician remained in the administrator's office. Farr was no longer in the building. He had been formally asked to leave pending further inquiry and had left with the quiet, precise movements of a man who was already calculating what his lawyer would need. Voss laid out the preliminary picture. The deletion queue on the workstation had contained 211 files scheduled for automated deletion at midnight. Of those, the technician had flagged 47 as potentially material to the investigation. The email correspondence was still being extracted, but the visible metadata included subject lines referencing staff records, medication audit preparation, and most significantly, a thread from 9 months ago with a subject line that read, software patch, logging behavior. The room was very still when Voss said that. You're saying someone modified the software deliberately, Osei said. Her voice was controlled in the way of a person gripping something tightly. I'm saying the metadata indicates a communication about software logging behavior that predates the errors your staff identified, Voss said carefully. I am not drawing a conclusion yet. That will require the technical team's full analysis. How long? Marsh said. Software forensics take time, but the communication record is recoverable regardless of the technical findings. And a communication about modifying logging software, in the context of everything else we've documented today, she paused. It completes a picture. Mara looked at the table, at the grain of the laminate surface, which she had looked at in 100 staff meetings, unremarkably, and now noticed had a long hairline scratch across the center that she'd never registered before. "The original complaint," she said. "The anonymous one. Can you trace the submission point?" Voss looked at her. "Through what means?" "IP address. Filing system metadata. The county health compliance portal logs every submission. It has to for legal chain of custody. If the submission came from inside this building, the IP address would map to the clinic's network." Voss was already writing. "That's a reasonable avenue." The prior complaint, the one from 8 months ago, filed from outside, that one might also be traceable if the same external email address was used to file it. Mara paused. If the address matches anything in FAR's correspondence, the timeline collapses into a single campaign rather than 2 separate complaints. The room absorbed that. Greer was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not admiration, not quite, but something close to the recalibration that happens when a person realizes they have fundamentally misread the situation they walked into. "How do you know how the county portal logs submissions?" Voss said. "I've filed complaints before," Mara said. "Different context, different state. The system architecture is consistent across county platforms." She paused. "I know how documentation works." Voss studied her a moment longer than necessary. "I'll pull the portal logs tonight." The brief ended at 7. Osei walked Voss to the exit. Marsh lingered, and Mara stayed because she wasn't finished thinking and didn't see the point of pretending she was. Greer was still in the room. He was standing by the window, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the parking lot in the way of a person who is not actually looking at the parking lot. She let him stand there. After a moment he turned. "I need to tell you something," he said. He said it in a different register than anything he'd said to her all day. Quieter, without the professional scaffolding. She waited. "The complaint form," he said. "When I got it this morning, there was a note attached, handwritten, on the routing cover sheet." He stopped. It said the subject had a documented history of non-compliance related to disability accommodation requests. It said to expect difficulty. She held very still. "I read that before I came in," he said, "and it affected how I read you. When I got here. The brace, the way you were standing your ground, everything you said, I was already—" He stopped again. "I came in looking for what the note described." "I know," she said. "That was wrong." "Yes," she said. "It was." He nodded. He didn't ask her to forgive him. She respected that. The ask for forgiveness was usually the energy to manage his discomfort for him. "The note," she said. "Do you still have the routing cover sheet?" He looked at her. "It should be with the intake paperwork. I need you to put it in the evidence file." He pulled out his folder. The routing sheet was there, clipped behind the complaint form. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they wish they'd seen differently the first time. He put it in the evidence folder. "That note," Mara said, "may be the most direct link to whoever coordinated with FAR. Handwritten notes are harder to walk back than digital correspondence." Greer was quiet for a moment. "You think someone in the department was involved?" "I think a handwritten note on a routing cover sheet doesn't arrive there without someone in the intake process putting it there," she said. "That might be FAR. It might be someone with access to the routing process. Either way, it's a thread." He took it back out of the folder and looked at it again. His jaw was set in the way of a man who was making a decision he couldn't unmake. "I'll flag it to the misconduct review," he said. "Officially, tonight." She nodded. The evening intake ran until 9:30. 2 more recovery dogs from the highway collision, a domestic cat with a bite wound from a stray, a working cattle dog with a suspected cruciate tear that turned out to be a deep soft tissue injury, better prognosis, longer recovery. Mara worked alongside Darla and Ramos, and the clinic moved with the particular rhythm that comes from a staff that has been through a hard day together and found out they could still do the thing they came here to do. At 9:45, she sat at the triage desk and wrote her end-of-shift notes. Rook was asleep on the mat Marsh had set up near the recovery area. Marsh himself had stepped outside an hour ago to take a call and hadn't fully returned. She could see him through the triage window, still on the phone in the parking lot, moving in the slow, deliberate way of a person managing a conversation that required careful navigation. At 9:58, he came inside. His expression had changed. Not dramatically. Marsh didn't do dramatic. But there was something in it that she had learned over the course of this particular day to read as significant. He came to the triage desk and stood with his arms crossed and his phone still in his hand. "Voss called," he said. "The portal logs?" "They pulled the IP address on the current complaint." He paused. "It doesn't map to the clinic network." She looked at him. "Where does it map?" "A public network access point. Coffee shop on Alderman Street, about 4 blocks from here." He paused again. Something in his expression shifted. "The submission timestamp is 6:42 yesterday evening." She ran the timeline. Yesterday evening, before her shift this morning, before Farr called out sick. "That's not Farr," she said. "No," Marsh said, "it's not." "Then someone filed it for him. Someone who knew the case reference number from the prior complaint. Someone with enough familiarity with the county health portal to submit a compliant form. Someone who knew the routing note would reach the incoming deputy." He looked at her directly. Someone who had done this before. She held his gaze. "The tech team pulled something else from the workstation," Marsh said. "Something they didn't include in the brief because Voss wanted to verify it first. One of the 47 flagged emails. The metadata showed a recipient domain that matched a county sheriff's office subdomain." The triage room was very quiet. "Someone inside the department," she said. "A subdomain doesn't confirm a specific user. It could be a shared inbox, an administrative address. But it's inside the department." "Yes," Marsh said. "It is." She looked at her end-of-shift notes, at the neat columns of patient data and procedure records, at all the careful documentation that had been done in this building by her and by Farr for very different reasons. "Greer filed the routing note flag tonight," she said. "I know." Marsh was watching her. "Which means if there's someone in the department who was coordinating with Farr, and that person had access to complaint routing, they now know that the note has been flagged as evidence." She understood what he was saying. The thread she'd identified had 2 ends. She'd pulled one end by asking Greer to document the note. The other end was somewhere she couldn't see, attached to someone who now knew the thread had been found. "How fast can Voss move on the subdomain?" she said. "A subpoena to the county IT division takes—" He stopped. His phone was buzzing in his hand. He looked at the screen. His expression went very still. "What?" she said. He looked up. "That's Voss." He answered it. She watched his face during the call, 30 seconds, mostly listening, 2 short responses, and then he ended it. "The 47 flagged files," he said. He looked toward the clinic's back entrance, not the front, not the direction of any sound she could hear. His ears came forward. His body went still in the particular way of a working dog that has registered something the people in the room haven't caught yet. Then the rear door of the clinic opened, and the person who walked through it was not a handler, not a technician, not anyone who belonged there at 9:58 on a Thursday night. And the look on their face when they saw Marsh standing at the triage counter was the look of someone who had made a very serious miscalculation about what they would find inside. The person who walked through the rear door was a woman. She was mid-50s, dressed in civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark slacks, the kind of deliberately unremarkable outfit that people wear when they want to move through a space without generating a description. She had a county sheriff's office lanyard tucked partially under her collar, visible only because her jacket had shifted during movement. She stopped 2 steps inside the doorway when she registered Marsh, and in that pause, that fractional, involuntary stillness, Mara saw the calculation happen in real time. The woman's name was Lieutenant Serena Pruitt. Mara didn't know that yet. She knew it 20 seconds later when Marsh said it. He said it the way you say something you have been holding in your mouth for a while, testing its weight. Lieutenant Pruitt. Pruitt's expression completed its adjustment into something controlled. "Commander Marsh, I didn't expect to find you here this late." "I imagine not," Marsh said. He didn't move from the triage counter. He didn't need to. His stillness was doing enough work on its own. "What brings you in?" "I was passing by. I heard the facility had a difficult day. The highway collision support, the compliance situation. I wanted to check in." "At 10 o'clock. I keep late hours." Rook was still watching the door. He hadn't moved from the mat, but his attention hadn't shifted from Pruitt since she'd cleared the entrance, and working dogs didn't sustain that kind of focus on something that wasn't registering as relevant. Mara noted it and said nothing. "This is Mara Solis," Marsh said. "She's the lead trauma nurse here." Pruitt turned to look at Mara. The look was brief and assessing and carried the specific quality of someone who has studied a subject in document form and is now seeing them in person for the first time. There was recognition in it, carefully managed, and underneath the management was something else, a rapid recalculation of how much of a problem the person in front of her represented. "I've heard of the situation here," Pruitt said to Mara. "I hope the day has been resolved to your satisfaction." "It's still being resolved," Mara said. "Of course. These things take time." Pruitt shifted her weight slightly toward the door she had come through, the tell of a person preparing to leave before they have found a reason to stay. "Well, I won't keep either of you. The email subdomain," Marsh said. Pruitt stopped. "The county IT division tracks outbound email from department subdomains," Marsh said. His voice was level, almost conversational. "Voss has the subpoena. It's processing tonight. The forensic team pulled the metadata from FAR's files about 30 minutes ago." He paused. "I think you already know that. I think that's why you're here." The room was very still. Even the recovery kennel sounds had quieted. The dogs were down for the night, sedated or sleeping, and the building had the particular late-night hush that makes every small sound carry further than it should. Pruitt looked at Marsh with an expression that had stopped pretending to be casual. "That's a significant accusation," she said. "I haven't accused you of anything yet," Marsh said. "I stated what the evidence review process is doing. Everything I said is public procedural information." "Then I'll say goodnight." "You'll want to speak with your attorney before the morning," Marsh said. "Not as a threat, as a factual observation about what the next 12 hours look like." Pruitt left through the same door she came in. Her exit was controlled and unhurried and would have looked like a dignified departure to anyone who hadn't seen her face when Marsh said the subdomain. Mara looked at Marsh. "Lieutenant Pruitt," she said. "Professional Standards Division," Marsh said. "She's been in the department 22 years. Her office processes all external complaint routing." He paused. "Including the routing cover sheet that Greer received this morning." Mara thought about the handwritten note on the cover sheet. The note that described her as having a history of non-compliance related to disability accommodation. Written by hand, not typed. Written by someone who knew the complaint was coming and knew how to prime the deputy receiving it before he walked through the door. 22 years in professional standards. 22 years of knowing exactly how complaint routing worked. 22 years of knowing which deputies asked questions and which ones followed the path they were handed. "She gave Greer the note," Mara said. "Almost certainly. The subpoena will confirm whether the email correspondence connects to her specifically." He picked up his phone. "I need to call Voss." While Marsh made his call, Mara sat at the triage desk and looked at the sequence from the beginning. 13 months ago, someone decided she was a target. Not because she had done anything wrong, because she was convenient, because the audit pressure on FAR was building, because the medication logs were a liability, and because someone with access to her classified military record had looked at a disabled veteran working a quiet clinic job and made a calculation about how much resistance she would generate. The calculation had underestimated her by a significant margin. What she still couldn't see clearly was the why. FAR she understood. He was protecting himself from an audit that threatened his position and possibly his freedom. Pruitt's involvement was larger and less immediately legible. A 22-year career in professional standards didn't typically end in coordination with a civilian administrator to frame a clinic nurse. There was something underneath that she couldn't see yet, a connection between Pruitt and FAR that preceded the current situation. She was still working through it when Marsh finished his call and came back to the desk. "Voss is expediting," he said. "She called in a warrant extension. The IT division will have the email attribution by 6 a.m. "What connects Pruitt to FAR?" Mara said. Marsh looked at her. He had the expression of a man deciding how much to say. "Tell me," she said. "All of it." He sat down across from her at the triage desk, the chair Priya usually occupied, and he looked at the desk surface for a moment before he looked up. "The billing audit on the clinic," he said. "The one that's been running for 6 months. It was triggered by a county health review, but the review itself was initiated by a tip from inside the department. A tip that alleged the clinic was systematically overbilling for controlled substance administration, specifically the record-keeping around K9 unit visits." She waited. The K9 unit has a service contract with Creston Valley. Monthly visits, routine care, emergency intake. The billing for that contract runs through the department's operational budget. He paused. Pruitt has been on the department's budget oversight committee for the last 4 years. Mara sat with that. Budget oversight. Billing audit triggered by a departmental tip. A clinic administrator facing audit pressure. A professional standards lieutenant who processed complaint routing and had been coordinating with that administrator and email correspondence sitting on his workstation. She built the structure. The K9 contract billing, she said slowly. Was there a discrepancy on the department side too? Marsh was quiet. Marsh. There is an open inquiry, he said carefully, into whether certain line items in the department's K9 operational budget were accurately represented in the last 2 fiscal years. And Pruitt's name is on the budget committee. Yes. So the audit on Farr's clinic wasn't just about what Farr was doing, Mara said. It was about what was happening on both ends of the billing. If the clinic's records showed one set of numbers and the department's budget showed a different set, the discrepancy becomes visible, Marsh said, and whoever was managing the discrepancy on the department side needed the clinic records to look unreliable, needed them to be associated with staff error, software problems, mismanagement, anything that would put the source data in question. They needed the clinic's records to be contaminated, Mara said, so that when the audit compared numbers, any inconsistency could be attributed to documentation failures here rather than deliberate manipulation there. That's what it looks like. She thought about the software modification, the logging behavior email from 9 months ago. Someone had introduced the duplication error into the clinic's system deliberately, not to steal medications, not to run a simple fraud, but to corrupt the documentation quality of the source records that an audit would eventually examine. And then they had needed a specific staff member to be associated with the errors publicly so that the contamination had a human face, so that when investigators looked at the flawed records, they had a person to point to. She didn't target me because I was an easy mark, Mara said. It came out quieter than she intended. No, Marsh said. She targeted me because I was the one filing the error reports, because I was the one creating a documentation trail that pointed toward the software problem rather than staff behavior. She paused. If I kept filing those reports, eventually someone would have pulled the software logs and found the modification. I was the risk. The complaint against you, Marsh said, was designed to remove you from the clinic before the technical team could be brought in. If Greer had succeeded, if you'd been suspended clinically, placed on administrative leave, there's no one pushing for the software review. The audit continues against contaminated records. The inconsistency gets attributed to clinic mismanagement. Farr negotiates a settlement, and the department-side discrepancy stays buried. She looked at the triage counter. At the space where the complaint form had sat this morning, where the old case reference number had been visible at the bottom edge. How many people in the department knew, she said. Pruitt's operation was small, Marsh said. These things usually are. 2 people with exposure is already a liability. 3 is a mistake. He paused. We'll know more after the email attribution. The next several hours moved in the particular register of institutional process, the kind of slow, grinding forward motion that happens when a formal investigation is pulling in evidence from multiple directions at once, and the results are coming in fragments rather than all at once. Mara went through the late night in segments. She finished her documentation. She checked on the overnight patients. She drank Priya's terrible coffee in the dark of the triage area and watched Rook sleep and thought about nothing very useful. At 2:17 in the morning, Bellamy Voss called Marsh. Mara was still there. She hadn't gone home. She hadn't been asked to leave, and she hadn't offered, and nobody had pressed it. She watched Marsh's face during the call. It lasted 4 minutes. His expression changed once, near the end, in the specific way of someone receiving a confirmation that reorganizes a significant portion of what they thought they understood. He put the phone down. The email attribution came back early, he said. IT expedited it. She waited. The correspondence in Farr's files, the 15 months of email, the majority originates from a department subdomain registered to Pruitt's administrative office. But there's a second address in the thread, a personal email account, non-department. The account holder was identified through the account's account recovery information. He paused. It's registered to a name, Marcus Wilford. She didn't recognize it. Captain Marcus Wilford, Marsh said. Retired. He left the department 3 years ago. Before he retired, he spent 11 years in budget oversight, she said. He chaired the K9 Operational Committee for 6 of those years, Marsh said. He and Pruitt served on the same oversight structure for most of the last decade. He retired with a full pension and a commendation from the county executive. A beat. He also sits on the board of a private veterinary service company that was in the running for the Creston County K9 care contract 2 years ago. Mara looked at him. The contract that went to this clinic instead, she said. Yes. She let out a slow breath. Not surprise, not shock. She'd spent enough time in institutions, both military and civilian, to know that the most damaging corruption was rarely spectacular. It was usually small and patient and motivated by things as ordinary as a lost contract and a retained budget line. 2 people who had been protecting something modest for a long time, and a third person, Farr, who had needed them when the audit pressure arrived. Wilford and Pruitt, she said. They've been carrying the billing discrepancy since the contract decision. We think the K9 service billing was being managed in a way that benefited Wilford's company indirectly even after losing the contract, Marsh said. The details are still being reconstructed, but the financial motive is there, and Farr came to them when the county audit started putting pressure on the clinic records. He came to them because he needed the audit to fail, Mara said, and they needed the same thing for different reasons. 3 people with converging interests, Marsh said. Farr handled the clinic side, introduced the software error, failed to act on the reports, set up the documentation to look like staff failure. Pruitt handled the complaint mechanism, the anonymous filing, the routing note, the deputy assignment, and Wilford had access to my military record, Mara said. Marsh looked at her. A retired captain with budget oversight history and ties to departmental contracting, she said. He would have had relationships inside the system, someone who could pull a classified personnel file through informal channels. She paused. That's how they built the targeting profile 13 months ago. That's how they knew what they were working with before they started. We don't have confirmation on that specifically yet, Marsh said, but Voss has Wilford's name now, and the financial forensics team is being briefed in the morning. She nodded. She looked at the triage room around her, at the clinic that had been, for 3 years, the quietest and most grounded part of her life. The place she had come to do work that mattered without any of the rest of it, without rank or record or history. 3 people with a billing problem and a lost contract had decided that the easiest solution ran through this room, through her specifically. I want to ask you something, she said, and I need you to be direct. Go ahead, Marsh said. My classified record. If Wilford accessed it through informal channels, through someone who owed him a favor, someone who shouldn't have pulled it, is there any possibility that the record was used to identify me specifically as a target? Not because of the clinic, not because of the audit, but because of what's in the record itself. Marsh was quiet for a moment. What are you asking? I'm asking if there's anything in my service history that would make someone with Wilford's background want me specifically removed from a position, she said. Not just removed from the clinic, discredited. He held her gaze. He was doing arithmetic again, but more carefully this time. The Kandahar citation, he said, the one you never received. When it was processed, the unit's action report went through a joint military-civilian logistics review, standard procedure for operations involving contract support. He stopped. Wilford's company had a contract with the Joint Logistics Support Office at the time. They would have had access to the unit action reports for any operations their contract covered. She sat with that. He could have seen the report, she said. He could have seen the report. And the report documented the evac, the casualties, the K9 asset. She paused. And the fact that a medic from the 68th had kept the operation from becoming a complete loss, even though the official record attributed the outcomes to the unit rather than any individual. If he read it carefully enough, Marsh said, he would have known the medic existed, even without a name. And when the audit pressure started and Farr needed a target and Wilford needed the clinic records contaminated, someone ran a search for staff at the clinic with 68th medical service history. She said it slowly, feeling the shape of it as she spoke. And I came up. That's speculative, Marsh said. Yes, she said, but it fits. He didn't argue. He looked at his phone at the time, almost 3 in the morning. He looked like he'd been awake for 20 hours and was running on the kind of sustained focus that military training produces and civilian life gradually erodes. "Go home," he said. "I'm serious. Voss has what she needs for the next phase. The forensic team is working overnight. There's nothing you can do in the next 6 hours that the investigators can't do without you." "I know," she said, but she didn't move. "Solis?" She looked at him. "You've been the most rigorous person in this building all day," he said. "You documented everything when nobody was reading it. You didn't sign the statement. You identified the routing note. You identified the IP avenue. You stayed inside every restriction he placed on you precisely enough that he couldn't escalate it further." He paused. "You've been fighting this since 7 this morning with everything except the right audience. You have the audience now. Let the process work." She looked at Rook. He had opened one eye at the sound of Marcia's voice and was watching them both with the lazy attention of an animal that has decided nothing in the immediate environment requires action. "He's been following me around all day," she said. "He's been looking for you for 4 years, Marsh said. "He can follow you around a little longer." She almost smiled. Not quite. She stood up. She gathered her jacket and her bag and the handwritten incident report she'd kept a personal copy of, folded into thirds and tucked under the triage desk all day, like a quiet insurance policy. She looked at the triage room one more time. "The morning shift comes in at 7, she said. "I'll be here," Marsh said. She went home. She drove the 18 minutes back to her apartment in Dunmore in the dark and the quiet, and she sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before she went inside because she needed a seam between the day that had just happened and whatever came next, and the car was the only place she could find one. The apartment was small and orderly and smelled like nothing, which was how she liked it. She set her bag on the kitchen counter. She made tea, not because she was going to sleep, but because she needed something to do with her hands. She sat at the kitchen table with the tea and the folded incident report, and the citation she still hadn't fully opened. She opened it now. It was exactly what Marsh had said it was. A commendation citation from a military records division formatted in the standard way of those documents, language that was precise and operational and not given to sentiment. It described actions under fire. It described the stabilization of casualties and the evacuation of a K9 asset. It described the medic's sustained performance under conditions that had resulted in serious personal injury, and it noted that she had declined personal evacuation until all other casualties were secured. At the bottom, in the signature block, was a note that hadn't been there when the citation was generated. It was handwritten, in ink, added after the fact. Marcia's handwriting. She recognized it from the notes he had been making all day at the triage counter. "This was owed to you years ago. I'm sorry it took this long to find you." She looked at it for a while. She folded it back along its creases and put it on the table. She drank her tea. At 6:42 in the morning, her phone rang. It was Voss. Her voice was alert and precise, in the way of someone who had not slept but had been productive in the hours she'd spent awake. "The financial forensics team completed the preliminary analysis," Voss said. "I wanted you to hear this directly." "Go ahead," Mara said. "The K9 service billing discrepancy covers 27 months. The total amount is significant. We'll have the exact figure in the formal report. Wilford's company received payments through a subcontracting arrangement that was not disclosed in the original contract documentation. Pruitt approved the subcontracting through budget committee procedure. Farr was brought in 18 months ago when the county audit inquiry was initiated and agreed to manage the clinic-side documentation in exchange for a structured agreement regarding the billing discrepancy. Essentially, the clinic's audit exposure would be minimized in exchange for cooperation. Mara processed that. Farr hadn't been a ringleader. He'd been a recruit, someone brought in when the people who had been running the scheme for years needed a new piece and found one in an administrator already under pressure. "The software modification," Mara said. "Confirmed," Voss said. "The technical team identified a custom script introduced into the clinic's medication logging software through a remote access session. The session was authenticated using administrative credentials. The timestamp is 10 months ago." A pause. "The script was designed to generate duplicate entries on a delayed cycle, not immediately visible, not dramatic enough to trigger automatic alerts, but consistent enough to build a pattern over time." 10 months ago, Mara said. "I started noticing the errors 8 weeks ago." "The script ran for 2 months before the errors became visible at the user level," Voss said. "It was designed that way, long enough to accumulate a meaningful pattern before anyone caught it." She thought about the 8 weeks she had spent documenting the problem, filing reports to FAR, being told it was on the list, continuing to document. The script had been running for 2 months before she saw it, and she had flagged it within 2 weeks of it becoming visible. If she had been the kind of person who filed one report and moved on, the pattern might have run for months more. "Mara," Voss said, "there's one more thing." She waited. "The warrant on Wilford's access to your military record," Voss said. "We ran the inquiry through the Military Records Division's access log this morning." A pause. And in the pause, something that might have been controlled anger, the professional kind. "Your personnel file was accessed 11 months ago. The access was authorized through a legacy clearance registration, a clearance that should have been deactivated on retirement but was still active in the system. The registration name is Marcus Wilford." She sat at her kitchen table in the early morning light and looked at the folded citation. "He accessed it himself," she said. "He accessed it himself," Voss confirmed, "which means the access is directly traceable. There's no intermediary, no informal channel. He used his own credential." A beat. "That is a federal offense. Unauthorized access to classified military personnel records. It falls outside county jurisdiction. I've already been in contact with the relevant federal office." Mara absorbed the full weight of that. A federal charge. On top of the county-level misconduct, the billing fraud, the corruption of official documentation, the conspiracy to obstruct an audit. Marcus Wilford had accessed her classified record using a dead clearance because he was the kind of person who never expected to be checked. The kind of person who had operated inside institutional structures for long enough that the rules had started to feel theoretical. He had looked at her file and seen a disabled veteran working a small clinic job and decided she was manageable. "Voss," she said. "Yes." "What happens this morning?" "This morning," Voss said, "we execute 3 simultaneous arrest warrants, Farr, Pruitt, and Wilford. County Sheriff's Office is coordinating with the Federal Field Office on Wilford specifically." A pause. "I thought you should know before it happened, before it became public." She thanked Voss. She ended the call. She sat in the quiet of her kitchen for another moment, and then she looked at her phone and saw that Marsh had sent a text 7 minutes ago while she'd been on with Voss. It said, "They're executing the warrants at 7. I'm at the clinic. Come in when you're ready." And then, a minute later, a second message. "Rook won't eat until you're here. He's being stubborn about it." She stood up. She put her jacket on. She looked at the folded citation on the kitchen table for a moment, then picked it up and tucked it into her jacket pocket, against her chest, where she could feel the slight weight of it when she breathed. She drove the 18 minutes to Creston Valley. She pulled into the parking lot at 7:12, and through the triage window she could see Marsh at the desk with his coffee, and she could see the gray-muzzled shape of Rook sitting beside the door watching the lot. The dog saw her car before she had finished parking. She climbed out. Rook was at the clinic entrance, pressed against the glass, tail moving in the deliberate, concentrated way of an animal that has decided something is worth waiting for. She walked to the door. He tracked her the whole way. She pulled it open and he pressed his head against the brace and stood there for a moment while she put her hand on him and let the morning be what it was. Behind her in the parking lot, a county vehicle she didn't recognize was moving toward the far exit, and a second one behind it, moving with purpose. She didn't watch them go. She already knew where they were going. She went inside. And standing at the far end of the triage room next to Marsh and beside a man she didn't recognize in a dark jacket with a Federal Field Office ID visible on his belt was Holt Greer. He looked at her when she walked in. He looked different than he had yesterday. Not smaller exactly, but recalibrated. A man who had made some decisions in the last 12 hours and was still living inside the reverb of them. He held out an envelope. She took it. She looked at it without opening it. "Formal reinstatement of your clinic access credentials," he said. "All restrictions lifted. The Misconduct Review Unit is attaching a notation to this morning's investigative record, acknowledging that the deputy who initiated the investigation acted on compromised information supplied through a corrupted complaint routing process." He paused. "That notation is official. It goes into the permanent record of the case." She looked at the envelope. "It also," he said, slightly more carefully, "acknowledges that the subject of the investigation, which is you, engaged throughout the process with full transparency, accurate documentation, and professional conduct." She looked up at him. "I know that doesn't fix it," he said. "No, she said. It doesn't. A beat. But it's accurate, she said. So I'll take it. She set the envelope on the triage counter and looked at the federal agent she didn't know, who was watching her with the particular expression of someone who had read a file this morning and was now revising their picture of the person in it upward. Ms. Solis, the agent said. He introduced himself, a name she registered and filed, and he told her that the federal inquiry into the unauthorized access of her military records would proceed separately from the county charges, and that her cooperation would be requested but was not required, and that as the subject of the unauthorized access she had specific rights that his office would walk her through. She nodded. There's one thing I'd like to understand, the agent said. He had the considered manner of someone who asked questions for a living. When you were filing those error reports, 4 of them over 6 weeks, to an administrator who you later discovered had reason to suppress them, at what point did you consider the possibility that you were being deliberately set up? Mara thought about it, not performing thought, actually reviewing the sequence in her own mind, going back to the medication room and the first duplicated entry and the quiet procedural response she had mounted. I considered it in week 5, she said, when the 3rd report got no response. I didn't have evidence at that point, but the pattern was consistent enough that I shifted my documentation approach. Shifted how? I started keeping personal copies of everything, hard copies, not just server files, and I started writing the reports in more formal language, the kind that's harder to dismiss as informal staff feedback and easier to enter into an official record if it becomes necessary. She paused. I also started including exact timestamps for every entry correction I made, not just the date, the hour, and minute. The agent looked at her for a moment. So your documentation from week 5 onward was essentially already formatted for evidentiary use. It was formatted to be accurate and complete, she said. If that overlaps with evidentiary use, it's because accuracy tends to be useful in both contexts. He wrote something in his notepad. Marsh, from across the triage room, caught her eye. He had the expression she had come to read as his version of a smile, controlled but present. She looked away before she acknowledged it too visibly, because there was still work to do, and the clinic opened in 45 minutes, and 3 dogs in the recovery kennels needed morning assessment, and the day shift was going to arrive to a situation that required explaining. She put on her scrubs over her jacket. She started the morning supply check. The soft clicking of the carbon fiber brace was the only sound in the medication room as she moved between the shelves, counting and logging, doing the work the same way she had done it every morning for 3 years. Methodically, without drama, the same whether anyone was watching or not. She had filed 4 reports that nobody read. She had documented everything in a system she suspected was compromised. She had refused to sign the statement. She had kept working. And then, at the end of that longest and most thoroughly documented day of her career at Creston Valley Veterinary Trauma Center, she was standing in her clinic at 7:19 in the morning with 3 arrest warrants executing across the county and a federal inquiry opened and her access credentials formally reinstated in writing. And she had won not because anyone had handed her anything, but because she had refused at every single turn to stop creating an accurate record of the truth. But she didn't have long to sit in it. Because at 7:22, when the day shift was just beginning to filter in through the front entrance, Priya appeared in the medication room doorway with her intake clipboard and a look on her face that Mara had learned by now to pay immediate attention to. "There's a man outside," Priya said. "He says he's a journalist. He's asking for you specifically." She paused. "He says he has documents. He says someone sent him a package last night with your military record in it, and he wants your comment before he publishes." Mara's hand went still on the shelf. Someone had sent a journalist her classified military record. A record that had been accessed illegally by Marcus Wilford 11 months ago. A record that was now evidence in a federal investigation. The timing was not an accident. Mara set down the medication log. She didn't rush. She placed it precisely on the shelf edge, smoothed the corner, and then walked out of the medication room and down the staff corridor to the front of the clinic, where she could see through the glass entrance a man standing in the parking lot with a messenger bag over one shoulder and his phone in his hand. The particular posture of someone who has decided they are patient but is actually not. She pushed the door open. The journalist was younger than she'd expected. Late 20s, maybe 30, with the slightly underfed look of someone who worked for a publication that still ran on ambition more than budget. He introduced himself as Terence Moyle, Creston Valley Courier. He said it with the careful confidence of someone who knew their outlet wasn't large but believed the story they were holding was. "Ms. Solis," he said, "I received a package last night. Physical package dropped at the courier's front desk after close. It contained printed documents, what appear to be military service records with your name on them, partially redacted." He paused. "There was also a typed note claiming that you falsified clinical records at this facility and that your military background was being used to deflect a legitimate investigation." She looked at him. The morning air was cool, and the parking lot still had the washed-out quality of early light that hadn't fully committed to the day yet. Behind Moyle, she could see the street, empty, a few passing vehicles, the ordinary beginning of a Thursday morning in a county that didn't yet know what had happened overnight. "Who sent it?" she said. "The package was anonymous." "Do you still have it, the physical package?" He hesitated. "Yes." "The documents inside are evidence in an active federal investigation," she said. "They are classified military personnel records that were accessed illegally 11 months ago by a named individual who was arrested this morning in connection with a separate fraud and misconduct case." She held his gaze. "If you publish them, you publish federal evidence obtained through an illegal access. That's not a gray area." Moyle's expression went through several quick phases. "I wasn't aware of an arrest." "It happened in the last hour," she said. 3 arrests, county and federal. The investigation involves billing fraud, corruption of official documentation, obstruction of a county audit, and unauthorized access to classified military records. The investigation is being handled by county compliance and a federal field office." She paused. "I can give you the names of both lead investigators. The story you've been handed is not the story that's actually here." He looked at his phone. He was already recalibrating. "The note that came with the package," she said. "Was it typed or handwritten?" He looked up. "Typed." "Font? Print quality?" He blinked. "It looked like a standard laser print." "I'd like you to hold the package," she said. "Don't publish. Call Bellamy Voss at the county compliance office. I'll write her number down for you. And tell her you received a physical package containing documents she'll want to examine. Tell her you received it last night after business hours." She looked at him steadily. "The package you were sent was a last-ditch attempt to use a journalist to do what an investigation was preventing. You were handed something that someone thought would still work even with the warrants executing." Moyle was quiet for a moment. I was looking at her with the expression of someone who had come expecting to conduct an interview and had instead been handed a considerably larger assignment. "Who sent it?" he said again. Not the reflex question this time, the real one. "I don't know yet," she said, "but the package being sent last night, timed to arrive before the public record catches up with the arrests, means someone knew the warrants were coming and made a last move." She paused. "Which means either someone inside the investigation leaked the timing or one of the 3 people arrested made arrangements before the warrants executed." She wrote Voss's number on the back of a triage intake form she'd carried out without noticing. She handed it to Moyle. He looked at it. He looked at her. "If I hold the package," he said, "and the story is what you say it is, the fraud, the arrests, the targeted campaign against a clinic employee, so I want access. An interview, full account." She looked at him. She thought about privacy and about the particular exhaustion of being a story rather than a person. She thought about the routing note and the classified record and the handwritten note on the citation she was still carrying in her jacket pocket. "Give Voss the package," she said, "and we'll talk." He left. She went back inside. Marsh was waiting in the triage area. The federal agent was still there, on his phone, making the kind of calls that happened in the immediate aftermath of warrants executing when everything suddenly required simultaneous documentation. Greer had gone. She'd missed the moment he left, which felt like its own small thing. "Package," she said to Marsh. "I heard," he said. He had that expression again, the recalibrated one. Last move. Someone made arrangements before the arrest, or someone inside leaked the timing. "The federal office will look at it," he said. "The package delivery can be traced. Drop time, any camera coverage on the courier's building, the print origin if the document examiner can work the paper." "Moyle's holding it," she said. "He'll call Voss." "You handled that well." He was doing his job, she said. He just needed the context he'd been deliberately denied. She went to the triage desk and looked at the morning intake board. 3 recovery patients needing assessment. The day shift filtering in. Darla had arrived, Ramos behind her, both of them moving with the careful awareness of people who understood something significant was still in motion and hadn't decided yet how close to stand to it. Dr. Osei came through the front entrance at 7:55, coat still on, pulling her bag off her shoulder. She looked at the triage area, at Marsh and the federal agent, and the particular arrangement of people that communicated volume even in stillness, and she walked directly to Mara. "The arrests," Osei said quietly. "This morning," Mara said. "All 3. All 3. Osei set her bag on the counter. She looked at the medication room door, at the recovery ward, at the triage intake board. She looked at the clinic she had built over 6 years and maintained over 2 more, and she looked at it with the expression of someone who has just been told something was nearly taken from them while they weren't looking. "Tell me what needs to happen today," Osei said. "Morning assessments on the recovery patients," Mara said. "The software technical team arrives at 9. Voss will need a statement from you. She already has mine and the tech staff accounts. But your statement as operating physician completes the clinical record." She paused. "And someone should call the day shift together before intake opens. They deserve to know the outline of what happened." "You do it," Osei said. "I'm not the—" "Mara." Osei looked at her directly. "They've been watching you get through this for 24 hours. They need to hear it from you." She did it at 8:15, in the staff lounge, with the day shift assembled and Priya standing in the doorway still holding her clipboard. She kept it short. She described what had happened factually, without editorializing, in the same register she used for any clinical briefing. She explained the arrests. She explained that the software technical team was coming to begin the formal correction of the dispensing records. She said the investigation was active and ongoing and that any media contact should be routed through Dr. Osei. Then Darla said, "Are you okay?" And Mara paused for longer than she meant to. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm tired." "What do you need?" Darla asked. Not performatively, just directly, in the way she had the night before when she'd admitted she'd looked at the floor and wished she hadn't. "I need us to open on time," Mara said, "because the animals that are coming through that door today didn't create any of this, and they still need care." That was enough. People went to their stations. The morning ran. The software technical team arrived at 9:03, 2 people from the vendor's compliance division with a third who was a third-party forensic analyst retained by Voss's office. They were professional and quiet and took over the administrator's office without disrupting clinic operations. By 10:30, they had confirmed what Voss had already established from the workstation data: the script, the insertion date, the mechanism. And by noon, they had produced a preliminary clean data set, restored from the pre-modification baseline, that showed the clinic's actual controlled substance administration record for the past 10 months without the artificially generated duplicates. Mara looked at the clean record when the analyst printed the preliminary summary. Every entry was accurate, every dose accounted for. Every administration logged correctly, traceable to a real staff member performing a real clinical function. Her name appeared in the records exactly as many times as it should have. No more, no less. She handed the printout back to the analyst and went to check on the afternoon intake. The story broke publicly at 2 p.m. on Thursday. It broke on the Courier's website, not as the story Moyle had been handed, not the version designed to discredit her, but as a factual account of the arrests, attributed to county and federal sources and including Voss's official confirmation. Moyle had written it fast and written it straight, and the version that went out named Farr, Pruitt, and Wilford described the billing fraud scheme and the audit obstruction, and included a 2-line statement from Voss's office confirming that the investigation had been precipitated by the consistent and thorough documentation of a clinic staff member who had raised concerns about software discrepancies over a 6-week period. It did not name Mara. Moyle had honored that. She hadn't asked him to specifically, but she'd been clear about what mattered, and he had understood the shape of it. By 3:30, the story had been picked up by 2 regional outlets and shared broadly enough that Creston Valley's phone had been ringing with a frequency that required Priya to set up a dedicated voicemail box for media inquiries. Dr. Osei made a brief public statement through the clinic's operating email confirming that the facility remained fully operational, that an independent clinical audit had cleared all staff of misconduct, and that the clinic was cooperating fully with the ongoing investigation. She did not hold a press conference. She had never been the kind of person who needed to. At 4:15, Bellamy Voss called. "The package that was sent to the courier," Voss said. "We examined it. The documents were printed from the same workstation in the administrator's office. The print metadata confirms the device ID. They were printed at 11:47 p.m. on Wednesday." Mara did the math. The arrest warrants had been signed before midnight. The warrants had executed at 7 a.m. The package had been printed at 11:47 Wednesday night. "Before the warrants were signed," Mara said. "Before," Voss confirmed, "which means it wasn't a last-minute move after the arrest timing leaked. It was pre-planned. The package was ready to go before the investigation reached its current point." She paused. "We believe it was Farr's contingency." "If the investigation got close enough to move," Mara said, "discredit the primary documentation source before the charges become public." "That's our assessment," Voss said. "He had the documents queued. He had the package prepared. He had someone drop it at the courier after hours." A beat. The person who dropped it was identified from the courier's external camera footage. It was Farr's assistant, a part-time administrative aide who says she was told it was a routine media delivery and had no knowledge of the contents. Mara closed her eyes for a moment. Ordinary people doing ordinary tasks in the service of something they hadn't looked at closely enough. That was how these things actually worked. Not through dramatic coordination, but through the mundane machinery of institutional life. Someone told to drop off an envelope. Someone told to route a complaint. Someone told to ignore a report. The architecture of harm built from small acts performed by people who mostly weren't paying attention. "The aide is cooperating," Voss said. "She's not a target." "Good," Mara said. "The federal charge on Wilford, the classified records access, was formally filed this morning. He appeared before a federal magistrate at noon. He's been released on bond pending trial." Voss paused. "He had the kind of attorney who arrives within 2 hours of an arrest, which tells you something about how long he'd been thinking about this possibility." "What's his exposure?" "Federal unauthorized access to classified records carries significant penalties, on top of the county charges for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction." A beat that contained something like satisfaction, carefully professional. "His attorney has already contacted the county DA's office about a cooperation arrangement. His value as a cooperating witness is limited given that Pruitt and Farr have their own attorneys and their own incentives. But the federal charge doesn't go away regardless of what he offers the county." She thought about Marcus Wilford, retired captain, board member, a man who had spent 22 years inside institutions and learned to navigate them by knowing which doors to leave unlocked and which records to access informally. Who had looked at her file and seen a liability. Who had looked at everything she had done and survived and decided it was a manageable obstacle. "And Pruitt," she said, "she has not cooperated, she has not made a statement. Her attorney is contesting jurisdiction on several of the county charges." Voss's voice was measured. "That's her right. It also means the trial process will be longer and more public. Every piece of documentation from the investigation becomes part of the public record at trial." Another measured beat. "Including the routing cover sheet with the handwritten note, including the email correspondence, including the targeting timeline." Mara understood what Voss wasn't saying directly. Pruitt's choice to fight it would make everything that had been done to Mara more thoroughly and publicly documented than a cooperation agreement would have. That wasn't justice in the tidy sense, but it was a kind of accountability that a negotiated outcome wouldn't have produced. "Thank you for calling directly," Mara said. "You built the foundation this case stands on," Voss said. "You deserve to hear it from me." She ended the call. She sat at the triage desk in the late afternoon quiet and looked at the recovery kennels and the 2 dogs sleeping soundly in them, and the medication room she'd been suspended from 16 hours ago, and the supply shelves she'd checked at 5:45 yesterday morning before any of it started. Rook was at her left side. He'd been there most of the day, navigating the clinical space with the practiced discretion of a working dog that knew when to stay visible and when to stay clear, and he was there now, pressing his gray muzzle against the carbon fiber brace and breathing slowly. "You picked a complicated morning to show up," she said to him. He looked up at her. His eyes were the same as she remembered, dark and steady, and carrying the particular quality that the best working dogs had, which was a kind of intelligence that didn't require you to do anything with it, that simply watched and understood and waited. "I know," she said. "Me too." Marsh appeared in the triage doorway at 5:30. He had been in and out all day. Calls, briefings with the federal agent, a meeting with Voss at the county office that had lasted 2 hours. He looked like a man who had gone 30-plus hours on something between no sleep and very little sleep, and was managing it through the particular discipline of someone who had done it many times before, and knew that acknowledging it made it worse. "The citation," he said, "the one from the Military Records Division, the formal version, not the copy I gave you." She looked at him. "The Military Records Division issued a formal correction to the personnel file this morning," he said. "The commendation that was never properly assigned is now in the official record, under your name, signed and dated." He paused. "I filed a supplementary report referencing the Kandahar action and specifically naming the medic." He looked at her carefully. "I should have done it 4 years ago, the unsigned citation. I should have pushed harder to find you." "You didn't know where to look," she said. "I didn't look hard enough," he said. "There's a difference." She held that for a moment. The imperfect thing that it was. 4 years of a citation sitting unassigned, of Rook carrying a scar and a history that connected to a woman in Colorado who had rebuilt her life around quietness. The gap between what should have happened and what did. "You found me," she said. "That's what happened." "Rook found you," Marsh said. "Rook helped," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. The small, private version of something usually kept internal. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Going forward." She thought about it. The real question, not what was she going to do about the investigation, about the media, about the formal processes that would run for months. What was she going to do with all of it? With the fact that she had survived something she hadn't chosen, that she had documented her way through a campaign designed to erase her, that Rook had walked across a trauma room and pressed his head against her leg, and in doing so had opened a door she hadn't known she'd been standing in front of. "I'm going to keep doing this," she said. "The work." "Here?" "I don't know where else I'd be," she said. It was honest rather than sentimental. She had tried other things. She had tried the version of her life that existed without this particular kind of work. In the 2 years after her discharge, when she had lived in a different city and done 3 different jobs, and none of them had felt like anything except waiting. This was the thing she was actually good at. The work of stabilizing something that was in pain, of applying the right amount of pressure to the right place at the right time, of keeping accurate records even when no one was reading them. "Dr. Osei is going to push for a program expansion," Marsh said, "based on everything that's come out about the K-9 contract billing. The county is going to need a new approach to the service arrangement, a more transparent one." He looked at her. She mentioned wanting to build out a rehabilitation component for working dogs coming off active service. Veterans, first responders. He paused. "She mentioned you specifically as someone who might lead it." Mara looked at Rook. I was looking back at her with the same steady attention he'd held all day. She thought about what a program like that would look like, the practical shape of it, the recovery protocols, the staff training, the documentation standards, the assessment frameworks for animals with complex service histories, and the people who had worked alongside them. She thought about what she knew about both sides of that experience, from angles that most people in this field didn't have access to. She thought about the border collie from yesterday's intake, and the shepherd from the highway collision, and the 2 handlers who had sat in the waiting area refusing to leave until their dogs were stable. "Tell her I'll think about it," she said. "She'll take that as yes," Marsh said. "I know," Mara said. He left at 6. The clinic's last intake of the day was a standard post-surgical follow-up, unremarkable, and Mara handled it alongside Darla while Ramos closed the supply room and Priya finished the daily log with the particular thoroughness of someone who had recently learned that thorough records mattered more than she'd previously understood. At 7:15, when the clinic was quiet and the overnight tech had arrived and the day shift had mostly filtered out, Mara sat at the triage desk one more time and completed her shift notes. She wrote everything accurately. Date, shift hours, patient outcomes, staff actions, supply inventory. The end-of-shift documentation that she had completed at this desk for 3 years. The same format, the same precision, the same attention to detail that nobody had asked her to maintain, and that she had maintained anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. And because she had learned a long time ago that the record you keep when you don't think it matters is the only record that can prove anything when it does. She wrote it all down. She was almost finished when Priya set a cup of coffee on the edge of the desk. Not Priya's terrible coffee. This was from the good place across the street, the one nobody went to during shifts because it was $6, and there was a coffee machine in the break room that technically worked. Mara looked at it. From the whole team, Priya said. She said it quickly, like it was embarrassing to say, and then went back to her desk before Mara could respond. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup. She sat with it for a moment and looked at the triage room, at the careful ordinary of it, the intake board and the equipment rack, and the worn corner of the counter where the clipboard hung. The clinic that had almost been taken from her by people who had looked at her brace and her quiet and her careful record-keeping and decided that those things were weaknesses. The brace was still clicking softly when she moved. It would always click. The nerve damage was permanent. The shrapnel scars were permanent. The particular way her left foot hit the ground was permanent. None of that was going to change because 3 people had been arrested, or because a commendation had been formally assigned to her name, or because a gray-muzzled Belgian Malinois had crossed a room and refused a command. What had changed was what was in the record. The record now showed everything: her reports, her documentation, the software modification, the billing scheme, the targeting campaign, the unauthorized access to her classified file, the arrests, the audit correction, the formal reinstatement, the commendation. All of it was in the record now, and records, unlike assumptions and snap judgments and handwritten notes on routing cover sheets, did not fade with distance or convenience. She was finishing the last line of her shift notes when her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, area code she didn't immediately place. She almost let it go. Then something made her answer. The voice on the other end was an older man, careful, with the measured diction of someone who had spent decades choosing words professionally. He introduced himself as the regional director of the County Veterans Services Office. He said he had seen the story that ran in the Courier and the regional pickup pieces and the official statement from the federal field office. And he said his office had been trying to locate her for 2 days because the military records correction that morning had flagged her name in a database that his office monitored. "What database?" she said. "Unresolved commendation citations," he said. "We run a quarterly check for veteran commendations that were processed but never formally delivered. We contact veterans when we locate them to make sure the record is corrected and the formal documentation reaches them." A pause. "Your citation has been in our unresolved queue for 3 years. This morning's records correction moved it to our active notification list." She was quiet for a moment. 3 years. The citation had been sitting in an unresolved queue for 3 years, being checked quarterly, while she worked at a small clinic in Dunmore, Colorado, and filed error reports that nobody read. "The citation," the director said, "is accompanied by an official letter of commendation from the Joint Military-Civilian Medical Evacuation Program. Given the nature of the action it recognizes, our office is requesting the opportunity to formally present the documentation. In person, at your convenience." He paused. "There is also, if you are open to it, a request from the Veterans Community Outreach Program to speak to current service members and veterans about the experience of medical discharge and civilian reintegration." A careful beat. "Your record, the full record, which was shared with our office this morning through the appropriate channels, describes a particular kind of experience that we don't often hear from directly. The combination of decorated service, significant injury, and successful civilian clinical career." "I'm not a speaker," she said. "We're not looking for a speaker," he said. "We're looking for someone who'll say the true thing, even when the audience finds it uncomfortable." She looked at the citation in her jacket pocket, the folded document she had been carrying against her chest all day without quite being able to set it down. "Let me think about it," she said. He gave her his direct number and they ended the call. She sat at the triage desk in the nearly empty clinic and looked at the triage room and listened to the quiet sounds of animals in recovery and the soft click of Rook's nails on the floor as he shifted position near the recovery ward door. She took out the citation. She unfolded it and looked at it again in the particular light of a clinic at the end of a long day. Not the dim reading lamp light she'd had this morning at her kitchen table, but the functional, unsentimental overhead light that made everything look exactly as it was. She read the operational language, the dates, the location, the description of the action, which was a description of a night she hadn't thought about as particularly extraordinary at the time, because she had been too focused on the 6 sequential tasks that the situation required to experience any of it as anything other than work. She had thrown herself over a dog because the dog was the nearest thing to her when the blast came, and she had no time to think about it being a dog rather than a person, no time to calculate whether it mattered. She had sutured the neck wound in a field tent with a headlamp taped to a crate and both hands shaking from the concussion, and she had told the K9 unit afterward that the wound had closed cleanly, which was technically true, and also somewhat optimistic given the conditions. She had declined evacuation until the site was clear and the remaining casualties were stable, and then she had let them take her, not because she was done, but because she was no longer the most critical resource in the room. She had done all of that, and then she had come home, or come to a version of home, and she had rebuilt herself around a quieter kind of work, in a quieter kind of place, and she had asked for nothing back from it except the chance to keep doing it. That was still true. She still wanted only that. But something had shifted in the last 36 hours. Not her goals. Those were the same. What had shifted was the shape of the room around her, the composition of the record, the set of people who now knew clearly what they were looking at when they looked at her. The commendation citation was not a transformation. It was not a reversal of the nerve damage or a restoration of the leg function or a retroactive undoing of the morning. Greer had suspended her badge in front of Mr. Hatcher and the border collie and the clinic waiting room. Those things had happened. They were in the record too. What the citation was accurate. That was its value. It made the record complete. She folded it along its creases one last time and put it back in her jacket pocket. She finished her shift notes. She signed them. 3 months later, Creston Valley Veterinary Trauma Center hosted the opening of its expanded rehabilitation program for working dogs, service animals, and the veterans and first responders who had worked alongside them. The program was the first of its kind in the county, built from a partnership between the clinic, the County Veterans Services Office, and the K9 Tactical Unit. The county board had approved the operating budget in a session that Mara had not attended, submitted through Dr. Osei, documented in the format that Mara had built from the ground up. The formal clinical director appointment came on a Tuesday, delivered by Osei in the same no-ceremony register she used for all clinical announcements, which Mara appreciated. On the day of the program opening, Commander Devlin Marsh brought Rook. The ceremony was small by design, a brief statement from Dr. Osei, a formal acknowledgement from the County Veterans Services Director, a sign on the wall that said Creston Valley K9 and Veteran Rehabilitation Program in plain lettering that Mara had specified herself because she did not want anything that looked like it was trying too hard. There were folding chairs and decent coffee and 3 current program patients, 2 retired working dogs and a K9 handler who was 3 weeks into an injury recovery protocol, watching from the side with the quiet interest of people who had arrived uncertain and had begun to feel less so. Mara stood near the recovery ward entrance when Marsh brought Rook in. The dog moved differently than he had 3 months ago. He was still gray at the muzzle, still larger than most of his breed, still carrying the old scar along the left side of his neck, where she had sutured him in the dark, in another country, in another life. But his movement had a different quality. Not looser exactly, but less braced. He had been coming to the clinic twice a week for 12 weeks, as part of a working dog senior care protocol that Mara had designed specifically for high-service military dogs with complex injury histories, and whatever she had built into that protocol was doing something that showed in how he moved. He saw her from across the room and came directly to her left side. She put her hand on his head. He pressed against the brace. She had stopped noticing the clicking years ago, and he had never cared about it at all. The County Veterans Services Director was speaking. She caught phrases: extraordinary service, community commitment, model for regional programs. And she let them pass over her because the actual meaning of the day wasn't in any of that language. It was in the handler sitting in the folding chair with his injured leg elevated, watching a retired shepherd sleep in the recovery kennel with the expression of a man who had not felt this settled in several months. It was in Priya taking notes at the registration table with the careful attention of someone who had learned that the documents you keep are the ones that matter. It was in Darla running the afternoon intake in the main clinic, 2 rooms over, handling it without Mara because Mara had trusted her with it, and Darla had turned out, under the right conditions, to be exactly what she had always been capable of being. It was in the work, specifically and unromantically, the same as it had always been. The criminal proceedings were ongoing. Farr had entered a guilty plea on 4 of the 7 charges against him, and the county DA's office had accepted a cooperation arrangement that would see him testify regarding Pruitt and Wilford's roles. His clinical misconduct charges were separate from his criminal ones, and the state licensing board had opened a parallel administrative review. Pruitt had not cooperated. Her trial date had been set, and the full documentary record of the investigation, everything, including the routing note and the targeting timeline and the 13 months of coordinated email correspondence, would be entered into evidence. Wilford had retained his federal attorney, and his federal charge showed no sign of resolution through a plea. The legacy clearance access was too direct, too traceable, and his attorney's options were narrow. Holt Greer was still employed by the county sheriff's office. The misconduct review had resulted in a formal written reprimand and a requirement for remedial training in disability accommodation and evidence evaluation. It was a lesser outcome than some of what he had done warranted, and Mara had said so in her formal statement, clearly and without heat. But she had also said that his decision to flag the routing note as evidence on the night when it mattered had materially contributed to the investigation. Both things were true. The record contained both. She had learned, a long time ago, that the world was not going to hold people fully accountable in the way that the clean version of justice implied. What it was going to do was create a record. And the record was the thing that lasted, longer than the people who created it, longer than the situations that produced it, longer than the particular morning when a deputy with a clipboard decided she looked like a problem he could manage. She looked at the room, at the program she had built, which was not perfect, which had a waiting list and a budget that was slightly too small, and a documentation protocol that she was revising for the 3rd time, because the first 2 iterations had produced gaps she hadn't anticipated, which had already, in 12 weeks, produced 3 patient outcomes that she would not have predicted from the baseline assessments. At Rook, gray and steady, at her left side. At the folding chair in the corner where a young woman sat watching the ceremony with the careful attention of someone who was still deciding whether this was a place she could trust. She had a service dog at her feet, a retired detection dog, 9 years old, with the settled gravity of an animal who had worked hard and was learning what it meant to be done working. The woman was herself a veteran, early 30s, medically separated from a position she'd been told she was too injured to continue and too qualified to easily place elsewhere. She had found the program through the county veterans office. She had come in for the dog and stayed because something else had opened up in the conversation. Mara had seen that particular opening before. In herself? In the early days after discharge, when she had not known yet that the quieter version of the work could be the same work, that the skills she had built in one context could be applied precisely in another, that what she had lost could become the foundation of what she was still capable of building. She walked over. She sat in the folding chair beside the young woman. Rook settled between them, touching both. The young woman looked at her, then at the brace, then back at her face, and Mara watched her do the calculation that people always did, trying to reconcile the disability with the directorship, the visible limitation with the program she was sitting inside. "How long did it take?" the young woman said. "To figure out where to land." Mara thought about it. Not the performed version of the answer, the actual one. "Longer than it should have," she said, "and it didn't happen the way I planned." She looked at Rook. "I came here to be quiet, to do the work and not ask for anything back from it." She paused. "Turns out that's not always how it works." "What changed?" "The record caught up to the truth," Mara said. "Eventually." The young woman was quiet for a moment. She looked at the retired detection dog at her feet, who was watching Rook with the measured interest of one experienced working dog assessing another. "I've been told that what I'm carrying doesn't qualify," the young woman said. "The injury, the separation, that it wasn't significant enough to warrant—" She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The shape of it was familiar. Mara looked at her directly. "People will tell you what your limits are," she said. "Some of them will be in uniform. Some of them will be behind desks. Some of them will have clipboards and authority and a particular kind of certainty." She paused. The only document that actually matters is the one you build yourself. And the only person qualified to assess what you're carrying is you. The young woman looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, just in the small specific way that happens when a person hears something true that they needed to hear from someone who had earned the right to say it. The ceremony had ended. People were moving, talking, the particular low hum of a room where something real had just been inaugurated. Dr. Osei was speaking to the Veterans Services Director near the coffee station. Marsh was standing with two of the program handlers, looking at something on a tablet. Intake documentation, probably, the next phase of the protocol. Priya caught Mara's eye from across the room and held up the registration clipboard. 3 new program referrals, all received in the last hour, all requiring intake appointments. Mara stood. Rook stood with her. She looked at the room once more, at the sign on the wall, at the program that had been built from 2 things: the work she had done for 3 years without asking for credit, and the record she had kept without knowing anyone would read it. Both had mattered. Both had been necessary. The invisible labor and the meticulous documentation, the quiet competence and the refusal, on one specific morning, to sign a statement that was not true. She looked at the young woman still sitting in the folding chair. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Bring her." She nodded at the detection dog. "We'll start the intake assessment." The young woman nodded. She wasn't all the way there yet. Mara could see that, the particular held-in quality of someone who had been told no enough times that yes felt like something to test before trusting. That was fine. That was where the work started, not with the breakthrough moment, not with the ceremony, but with the appointment on Thursday, and then the one after that, and the record built one entry at a time from the ordinary accumulation of showing up. Mara walked across the room toward Priya and the intake board and the 3 new referrals and the afternoon that was still ahead of her. The brace clicked with each step. It had always clicked. It always would. She didn't slow down.